Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was Raised by All for One? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Problem Child. Izuku Midoriya startled, biting back a squawk of surprise as his teacher's voice cut through the silent classroom. The boy's feet jerked awkwardly outward, kicking the desk in front of him, a hard twang echoing like a bell in the child's ears. Damn it. Izuku had come back to the classroom early after lunch to finish up a few last-minute details in his analysis notebook. There'd been a fight earlier that morning on the way to school, and even though he'd only gotten a few glimpses of the action, the boy couldn't get the memory out of his head. It had been All Might. He'd been out there, fighting using his power, or what was left of it anyway, and several other, newer heroes were acting as backup in case the number one needed them. Not that he did. This was All Might we were talking about. But still, Izuku had counted 4 other heroes there, waiting to jump into the battle. And so Izuku had been buzzing, determined to capture the images, unable to really let them go until they were sketched out and in his book for analysis. Which was why he was here before class started up again for the afternoon schedule, his lunch eaten and his sketchbook in hand. He'd wanted to finalize a few of the details he'd been replaying all morning. The things that he'd admired about All Might's abilities. The things he'd figured he could use in his own training. And Izuku had figured that he could just sketch here, in the emptiness and the quiet of the classroom. No one ever came here. No one ever really wanted to. Izuku would know. He'd spent a lot of time in here when people were just too loud and he felt too out of place in the school itself. It had always been a nice break, a calm place to escape from others. He hadn't expected to run into anyone, least of all his teacher. And yet here the man stood, as Izuku lifted his head to confirm as his teacher sighed. And yes, it really was Aizawa, sensei, standing there with his bright yellow sleeping bag folded over one arm and a firm scowl painted on his face as he eyed Izuku thoughtfully, maybe judging him. And oh God, what had Izuku done now? The boy could feel the way his palms were already warm and sweaty as the boy lifted his eyes and straightened his position to peer towards his teacher. We need to talk. Oh God. Those 4 words sent warning bells ringing in Izuku's ears as the room suddenly felt 10 times smaller, each noise growing louder as Izuku's sensei stared at him expectantly. Expectantly. The man's face was pulled into a frown, pitch-colored gaze trained on the boy as he peered down his nose at Izuku. Expectant. As in, he wanted a response of some kind. And Izuku honestly didn't know what to say or how to say it. He didn't know what his sensei even wanted, but he knew that it was something that Izuku wouldn't like, judging by the man's expression and the way he stood at the front of the room, near his desk and well away from Izuku. It was like Aizawa-sensei knew to keep away from Izuku because what he was going to say was something Izuku probably feared. Dreaded, maybe? That's stupid though, the boy chastised himself, trying to quash the thoughts as quickly as they wafted through his senses and trickled through his brain. You can't know. But maybe. It was usually like that, right? The boy tightened his grip on his pencil, peering up with wide eyes at his homeroom teacher. He didn't want it to be like that though. He didn't want to think the worst. Izuku didn't want to suspect that this could be the end of all things or that his sensei was angry at him for something. Something that he didn't say? Or something he didn't do? Or something you didn't deserve, right Izuku? Yeah, like that. What if it is about one for all? His thoughts spewed out theories, worried and anxious-addled as he tried to stop his bouncing legs and his trembling arms from going noticed by others. Well, just his sensei was here, in this room with him. Still standing. Still waiting. Still staring at him expectantly. Hopefully. But what if he does notice? Oh no. Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no. That tie is an abomination, problem child, and it's time we fixed it. Izuku's eyes widened, his spiraling thoughts screeching to a halt with a hard slam and such a quick ending that the boy was caught completely off guard by what had happened and what had just been said to him. What? The doom-thinking and agitated speculating was upended and the cogs in the boy's brain struggled to turn once again as Izuku only blinked back at his teacher, completely incapable of comprehending what had just been said to him and why the hell it actually mattered. What? There was another beat of silence, a weight settling awkwardly between them as Izuku's teacher leaned lightly on his desk, hands resting on the carefully flat as he tilted his head in questioning towards the boy. Aizawa-sensei furrowed his brow at the boy's silence, onyx orbs searching Izuku's face as he waited for the child to answer. And when he didn't, the man only hummed softly and shook his head, gaze flashing with a questioning flicker. What did you think I was going to say? Izuku balked at the question and the soft demand for honesty that his sensei was seeking, clearly aware that Izuku's thoughts were somewhere far, far away from thinking about ties and their messiness and whatever it was that Aizawa-sensei had said about the way that Izuku's looked. Abomination or something like that. And no, nothing. The boy hastily replied, unwilling to admit to his fears and agree to be completely honest with his sensei just yet, even though part of him was kicking himself for doing that, lying so easily, so casually, so quickly. I was just confused. A wave of guilt lapped at his senses as he tried to quell the thoughts that swished and swamped him, the dreaded idea that the man had finally figured things out about his quirk, about All Might, about any of it, and the fact that he was too scared to trust the man that had saved him not too long ago. And here Izuku was lying to him about the truth. But I'm trying to protect him, he justified, pushing his shame down, trying to swallow the bile back as he forced a half-hearted smile on his face. I'm trying to do the right thing. Right? It was the right thing, wasn't it? But, what's wrong with my tie, sensei? Izuku changed the subject, back to the original comment, trying to keep the darker thoughts at bay for now. I don't see anything, I don't think there's really anything that bad, is there? Again, Izuku was lying and he knew he was. Izuku knew dim and well what was wrong with the tie as his hand carefully reached up and tugged near the knot. He thought it looked nice though, didn't it? He earned an eye roll from his teacher for his quip as he straightened and huffed, gray capture weapon swishing lightly around his shoulders as the man held out his hand in expectation. I won't even deign that with a response, Aizawa deadpanned, giving a response anyway as he gently gestured with his fingers that Izuku start moving. Now, hand me that thing. Let's get this over with. Again, all Izuku could do for a minute was blink in surprise. What? Nothing was going to plan and Shoyuda was left feeling equal parts flummoxed and concerned at how everything was unfolding. And really, why had he decided to do this again? So, I turn this bit around the back and then dot up and through? Problem Child's face was scrunched up in concentration, verdant eyes laser focused on the task at hand as unskilled and unsteady fingers attempted, once again to move the loose ends of red together into the perfect knot. Shaking and twisting in the wrong direction, moving over and then backwards resulted in a haphazard noose that didn't resemble what the man had taught the boy at all as the child continued to mutter to himself, twisting and untwisting the material around his neck. Oh, but that's not right at all. Maybe I did it backwards. He had. But if I undo that bit then it will take the shorter end and make it too long. And yes, it would. So how do I make this front end longer and pull it through the top like he said but without it going into a big ball? Well, maybe if I just pull this here, there was another turn of the material, another soft tucking and a pull through and really, how the hell could he have messed things up that badly? Shoyuda shook his head disapprovingly and reached forward once more. Not quite, Problem Child, he murmured patiently, his confusion mixed with a determination to teach this skill. Because the kid needed to know it. You have it backwards. Start with the opposite side of the fabric. The wider end needs to fall on the outside when you're done, so you'll need to use that as the loop for the top of the knot, where it sits at your throat. Not the shorter bit. There was a soft, "oh," that whispered through the air as Izuku nodded his head after a moment, his gaze trained on the tie in his sensei's hands as he studied the fabric. The boy's ears turned a soft shade of pink as he tipped his gaze downward, away from Shuda's face. Sorry. It's nothing to be sorry for, the man remarked easily, trying to help the kid understand. This was just a simple skill, one that Shoyuda had learned a long time ago and needed Problem Child to understand. Though he still wasn't sure why it was his job to do it. Why he needed or felt he needed to do this. Though oddly he did. Not that it mattered right now to consider. It wasn't so important. Not really. Let's go through this again. Shoyuta grasped either side of the fiery red tie tighter, pulling them outward in demonstration, his movements slow and methodical to allow Problem Child to follow along with his movements as he turned each end of the tie together into the first knot. That's one. The man's thoughts simmered calmly as he adjusted the material again, going for the second round, turning the same end, the fatter section around the back and out through the top of the neck loop to face the front. That's two. Then, folding and turning the fatter end over the skinnier section once more, Shoyuta created a small, sideways loop that covered over the first two knot, and held open the space between the no and his loop with his hand before carefully taking the end of the fatter section of the tie and turning it underneath and behind the knotting around the boy's neck. One more. The man's voice was even, thoughtful as he carefully tugged the material upward before tucking it down, through the opening he'd created with his hand, pulling downward to complete the smooth circle and easing the end through the loop. Oh! Midoriya's voice was brighter than it had been a moment ago as a spark of realization trickled through his timbre. Which was good, Shoyuta decided, almost wryly as he released the two ends of the tie into the boy's care once more. He watched the boy's scarred hand fumble and fiddle with the silk material, undoing the knots entirely to start the process over. I start here with the one knot over. The boy's voice wavered, his lips puckered in as he narrowed bottle-green eyes in concentration on his task. And then I pull this through and do the same thing this way, but leave it underneath. Shoyuta had to admit that the kid was a quick study as he maneuvered through each one of the man's instructions with careful precision. It really was a testament to the boy's quick thinking and keen eye. A dark gaze flickered towards the forgotten notebook on the desk a few feet away as Shoyuta stewed. Always sketching away in that thing, the assessment was swift but precise, brought about from countless hours of studying the boy's behaviors. And then I wrapped the thin end around one more time before pulling it, underneath. The kid received a nod of affirmation, which seemed to encourage him. Beaming up at Shoyuta, and why did that do a funny thing to his chest? Problem Child turned his attention back to the tie, carefully situating the material around and through, tightening the newly tied material smartly against the collar of his uniform shirt. And now the material looked far more like a tie than it ever had before, situated as it was now as the boy carefully smoothed the invisible wrinkles that had been tugged and eased away through Shuta's repeated demonstrations. Long, jagged scars caught the man's attention as shaking fingers fiddled to position the crimson to perfection, and the man couldn't help the odd thoughts that crept up at the idea that this boy seemed different in more ways than one. Self-assured and yet not. Which didn't make sense to the man, given what he knew of the boy. Which, admittedly, wasn't a lot. At least not enough to really get an inside look into the child's life, and his world prior to UA, and understand those driving thoughts that provoked those odd actions, words and quiet retreats into himself when he thought he was alone, like he'd been here in the classroom. Midoriya's face split into a satisfied grin as his nose twitched, freckled cheeks wrinkling as the smile broadened as he tapped the tie lightly with his pointer before flicking his gaze upward to meet his sensei's, seeking approval. And Shoyuta gave it easily this time around. This seventh, or was it the eighth attempt, had been far better than the last, as he admired the kid's handiwork as well. It's better, the man's voice rumbled softly in his chest, as he tilted his face into his capture weapon, studying the boy's careful knot, grateful that if the kid practiced a few more times he wouldn't have to look at that monstrosity of a tie job the boy'd been sporting the last several weeks. What an eyesore that had been. And it had only taken a month before Shoyuta cracked. A month of staring at the monstrosity around Problem Child's neck, garbled and knotted and wrinkled in the most bizarre way. It didn't even resemble a tie anymore, which was a feat. Only a month before Shoyuta called the boy to attention to fix the blasted thing. God damn it. And really, a month was quite a long time by Shuta's standards, if he were being honest. It was a month too long, in his opinion. A month of staring and watching and assessing, wondering if the Demed thing would ever be fixed. If he'd ever see progress on the tie front. A month of wondering why he ever really cared about the tie in the first place. The man shook his head and let the thoughts slip away. It was a useless endeavor to stew on right now. Fingers tapped lightly against his thigh as the exhausted teacher blinked and rolled his shoulders. You've made a lot of progress. Good job. Shoyuta amended quietly with a nod, standing with a stiff shuffle, as he changed his thoughts and the subject. The man tried to ignore the way the boy's eyes widened at the compliment, shock swishing in that deep green gaze before the kid tamped down his emotion and quickly swallowed, which irked the man to think that the boy should be surprised to receive a compliment for something so trite. Why would he be shocked? Why surprised at receiving a compliment of any kind? But Shoyuta also noted the hesitant, "Thank you," Midoriya choked out, filled with far more emotion than he'd have guessed possible. And a second peek back towards Problem Child gave the visage of the boy's face. Eyes were shining and misty, embarrassment coloring freckled cheeks. He wasn't good at hiding all his emotions, it seemed. The man cleared his throat. "Now practice that 2 more times to make sure you can do it on your own," he retorted gruffly, though not unkindly, as he tried to stifle the awkwardness of the moment with a push forward to something productive. "Had to keep the momentum going, right?" "All right." The child's voice cracked as he nodded hastily and returned to his mission, the notebook still sitting innocuous on the desk, forgotten for the moment, in favor of the present, the conversation, the current task. Which was probably the healthier option for the kid, Shoyuta supposed. Focus on what you can see in front of you for now, Problem Child. The boy's homeroom teacher slowly moved through the row of desks and back to his own seat, pulling out a jelly packet from the top drawer, gaze briefly drifting back to the hyper-focused teen who'd unraveled his tie and was making slow work of tying it once more. Brows were furrowed again, eyes narrowed, and a deep frown pulling at a normally smiling face. Midoriya's fingers continued to tremble. A constant issue that seemed to plague him, though his movements in coiling the material around seemed steady enough, delicate wrapping of crimson silk slipping through stumbling fingers. Shoyuta supposed that trembling would always be there, in the boy's hands. Maybe it had been there before he'd hurt himself in the sports festival too. The man couldn't be sure. He'd never taken the time to really look and understand. Study the situation and the child until now, that is. And sitting, he could see that there was a tremor that shook fingers and worked into the boy's palms, up the wrists. A constant pain perhaps. A constant issue that he'd have to pay more mind to. "I'll have to make a note," he mused idly, turning a brief glance to the time and letting out a silent groan as his own tremble of exhaustion flickered in protest to his realization. There wasn't enough of the lunch hour left to get a proper nap in. Figured. The man turned back to the boy briefly, watching the progress for a moment more as the sense of annoyance at losing his napping opportunity waned. The taste of apple tipped down his throat as he inhaled his jelly pack, and stewed, thoughts flickering between ideas, theories, considerations as he watched for a moment more before he adjusted back to his own present and took his own advice to stay on task. Much like he admonished the boy to do. He supposed he could get some grading done in the silence. Languid fingers reached for the small stack of exams sitting at the corner of his desk, blue pen tucked neatly next to it. A timer placed at the other end was waiting for his attention, with a 10-minute deadline for each exam, each essay, each grading component. Shoyuta reached out and dialed the electronic timer into the appropriate timing, as he reached for Ishido's exam and his pen. For once it seemed the boy wasn't keen on asking any questions, which was odd. But he'd at least do what he could while the time allowed. "Sensei? Can I ask, who taught you, to tie a tie?" "Nevermind." With a long-suffering sigh, because he should have realized that was bound to happen, Shoyuta set his pen down and peered into the wide, inquiring gaze of the boy, who held his tie in each hand, temporarily abandoning his task in favor of harassing his teacher. Typical problem child behavior. Shoyuta really should have just given up on trying to do anything and simply waited for the boy to ask the questions he'd inevitably would have had. He knew the kid well enough to know they were coming. He should have just waited. And Shoyuta, who feigned mild annoyance, found that it was he wasn't so bothered to address the questions and avoid his own grading tasks, as he lifted his eyes to meet the boy's face more fully, watching the hesitant worry flicker again in the boy's face as he waited for his sensei to answer. And why worry? Odd, his mind whispered, rifling that thought away for analysis later, when he could think more clearly on the moment, instead of addressing the boy's question here in the present. Because that was more important. Hizashi, was the man's soft, simple reply. Insisted on it? Actually. And much to Shuta's surprise, the kid's gaze widened further, shock renewed in his gaze as he straightened and leaned forward at the desk that he'd been sitting at. Not your dad? Answer clicked, slipping easily into place with that simple reply, the wide-eyed question from the tentative voice of the boy in front of him. And it really should have been obvious sooner for Shoyuta. He should have seen the signs before and realized why the boy was asking the question, and why it mattered so much for the kid to understand the answer to it. And Shoyuta was an idiot, it seemed, because he hadn't caught on. He hadn't understood. For as obvious as Izuku Midoriya could be, he could also be rather vague, closed off, and aloof when he chose. Again, it made no sense. Not one bit. Nevertheless. Answer the question, Sho. The man shook his head lightly and set his hands carefully on his desk. Grading was a lost cause. It wasn't so important anyway. He hated grading papers and assigning numbers and values to students when he could just assess by watching their progress. No, the man remarked carefully, threading his fingers together as he appraised the boy's posture and face turned in rapt attention towards him. There was an unreadable emotion swirling in those bottle-green eyes as he studied his sensei, no doubt analyzing each comment that Shoyuta would make, trying to understand the importance of this situation, especially in relation to himself. Yes, Shoyuta was an idiot. No, my dad wasn't one for things like that, the underground hero continued, somewhat vague in his reply, not wanting to go into too much detail about the background he wasn't keen to dredge up just yet, especially with a boy that didn't need to understand the issues that he carried. Because they weren't important. At least, not to anyone but him. His feelings weren't so important. Not as important as this was here and now. And you've seen present Mike, Shoyuta continued with a small wave, he loves fashion and dressing smart. He saw my sloppy attempts the first day of class and made it his mission to rectify the situation. Among other things, Shoyuta thought with a flash of fondness for Hisashi's overbearing presence. The man had made it his personal quest to befriend him when he tried everything in his power to dissuade the excitable voice hero. They were decidedly two very opposite figures, and Hisashi had always known that. Yet he'd persisted, and persisted, and persisted. Not that Shoyuta would think to change things now. He'd grown somewhat used to the opposite nature that balanced his own in many ways. It helped to temper things just a bit. Oh, came the soft reply as a small, wistful smile wormed its way onto the boy's face, another flicker of emotion striking the bottle-green gaze of the boy as he seemed to turn into his thoughts for a second, not seeing his sensei fully as he seemed to consider his own world, his own memories. I'm glad you had a friend to do that for you. Hesitant green eyes peered into onyx ones as the man observed the boy quietly for a moment, measuring the equal levels of hurt, longing, and admiration shining in the kid's gaze. A measure of vulnerability only apparent to Shoyuta, here and now in the quiet of the empty classroom that Midoriya seemed to frequent on his own far more often than Shoyuta realized. With still another soft sigh, the man waved his hand towards the boy, frowning half-heartedly at Izuku, who straightened as Shoyuta stood again, and moved once more towards the kid's desk, footfalls heavy and purposeful. He wasn't about to startle the kid any more than he already had today. Give that thing here again, problem child, he huffed fondly, placing a heavy hand in the boy's curls because he understood a little better now. Let's go over this again. And if his problem child didn't quite grasp how to tie his tie, and came back the next day to practice some more, well, Shoyuta wasn't too bothered by it. Now this tense goes in the third sentence, which means I have to change the fifth sentence and use the second option, unless it's the other one. Yeah, that makes more sense to do it that way, and then I can tell Mike Sensei here that these tenses are supposed to be used for. Problem child, follow me. Izuku Midoriya's head snapped up from his essay, his neck giving a soft crack, as everything adjusted awkwardly after sitting so long with his head tilted downward. Bottle-green eyes widened in confusion. With pencil poised in his hand and balancing his notebook in his lap, the boy could only stare at the retreating form of his sensei who had passed through the room silently, footfalls even, gray capture weapon swaying as he adjusted his shoulders and shoved his hands in his pockets, heading towards the kitchen and back hall that led towards the teacher's apartment. Hurry up, kid. The man repeated, casting a sidelong glance back at Izuku, thin-lipped expression nonplussed and tired. "We don't have all day to simply sit and stare." "And what?" A flicker of curiosity and worry sparked in the boy's senses as he stared after the man who turned back towards the kitchen and continued on through, a soft grunt whistling from his mouth as he retreated into the dimmer hallway and towards his own apartment area, still clearly beckoning for Izuku to follow. Still, it took a good 10 seconds of staring before the would-be hero actually made any sort of attempt to do what his sensei requested. What could he want? It was Saturday and the dorms were quiet. There weren't any classes to worry about dashing off to get to or practice for, so Izuku had just positioned himself in what was becoming his favorite chair in the common room, angled near the window, providing lots of natural, warm sunlight, determined to finish his English assignment before the afternoon was done. He had nothing better to do, nothing else to worry about, so why not try to tackle the homework while it was quiet and some of the others were away visiting family and everything was calm for a minute? Because, as it turns out, verb tenses and latent phrases were hard. At least they were for Izuku, and he needed as much time as he could get to tidy things up in his work and make everything sound right. But then, "Now, problem child." The man's voice echoed from the all, distinctly disinterested in brooking any further argument or hesitation from Izuku. "Oh, all right." Izuku was up and moving, hastily collecting his school work and shoving everything into his bag as he stumbled after his sensei, determined to catch up. So much for his homework. The boy scrambled down the hall, after his teacher, who languidly moved through the living area there and made towards the apartment's front entrance. Quickly slipping his house shoes off, the man pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch of one, as dorm as Izuku followed suit, moving to reach for his own pair that had been collected. And when did that happen, and were waiting by the door as well? Gingerly placing his book bag and belongings by the door, the boy tied his shoes and tumbled through into the sunshine, his ears ringing as the sound of birds chirping echoed in the trees overhead. He earned a few curious glances from some of his classmates, Bakugo shooting him a fierce glare before turning back to his own schoolwork as he sat at the bench underneath one of the larger wisteria trees near the pathway, but no one dared say anything. Seemed everyone else was just as confused about what Aizawa-sensei was doing as Izuku was. Izuku nearly tripped over a crack in the sidewalk as he upped his pace, trying to get closer to his teacher as Aizawa-sensei peered back at the boy, eyes narrowed. A firm, thoughtful scowl marred the man's face as he huffed tiredly before moving down the stairs and towards the walkway that led to the main campus. "We don't have all day, problem child, so hurry up," he replied easily as continued moving, hands in pockets and head tilted into the crook of his capture weapon. "You're not getting out of this one either." By this point, Izuku was completely confused but more afraid of what might be happening that he found he had nothing to say and no way to convince himself to say it. So he simply followed. Because what would happen if he didn't follow? Would he make Aizawa-sensei angry? Would he make the situation worse than it seemed to be? Izuku didn't want to risk it. Not that he wanted to believe that his sensei would be that mean or get that upset. He didn't really think of Aizawa-sensei as the type that would do that, in truth. The boy bit his bottom lip as he stewed and continued to traipse after his teacher silently, palms sweaty, as anxiety festered. And really, he respected his sensei too. And Izuku didn't think he'd want to try to not listen. Izuku cared about doing the right thing, or at least trying to do the right thing, and whenever Aizawa-sensei said something it was usually for his good, right? So of course Izuku wanted to listen to his teacher and he wanted to care about what Aizawa-sensei swallowed back the sudden wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm him, trotted behind the man, fingers idly grasping at the cuffs of his sleeves of his hoodie, confusion and trepidation making everything seem too bright, too loud, and his feet too heavy. He didn't understand what was going on and he feared that if he continued to think too hard about it that everything that he didn't want this to be would actually be what he was dreading. The boy could feel his throat growing tighter as he bit back a soft squeak, the questions continuing to spiral through his thoughts. What were they doing? Why were they? "You're not in trouble," Aizawa's voice cut through Izuku's muddled thoughts as he tilted his head briefly towards the fretting boy. A thoughtful expression flittered across the man's face for a moment, settling in his gaze as he stared back at Izuku, brows knitting together briefly as his eyes narrowed. "No anger though." Aizawa-sensei only studied Izuku for a moment, like some bug under a microscope. And it made the kid feel too exposed as he halted awkwardly and peered back at his teacher. It's just time that we address an issue, problem child. Long overdue, he muttered softly, with a quiet sniff following. The man's fingers twitched as the breeze rustled Aizawa-sensei's hair, pulling the loose strands from his bun, as the leaves in the trees quaked nearby. And Izuku's keen observations didn't miss the way the man's gaze lingered on the boy's arms as he'd spoken, scanning Izuku's hands and moving upward towards the boy's wrists and elbows and shoulders. No doubt, Aizawa-sensei made a note, Izuku was sure, to see that Izuku's arms were clad in their compression sleeves, to help create stabilization and provide enough pressure to ease some of the lingering itchiness that the boy still felt. Not that he'd ever say that he felt those things. Not out loud. And certainly not in front of his sensei, as he stood there bearing the scars and damage of some rather regrettable choices. Choices that his sensei seemed to be rather displeased about as he sighed again and turned back towards his forward march towards the main building. Izuku wasn't about to admit that he was hurting when he'd already caused enough problems for the man. Come on then, kid, the underground hero remarked evenly, his voice muffled as he tucked his chin into his capture weapon, hands resuming their normal position in their pockets, as Izuku nearly tripped again to follow close behind, one arm coming up to rub against his other. He'd admit that others regretted his decision to do what he did, the damage he'd inflicted on himself, the way he'd torn himself apart, and gone far beyond what he should have. But for Izuku it was not regrettable enough that he wouldn't have done the same thing again to protect Kuda from Muscular. And if Aizawa's comment that he wasn't in trouble was meant to make the boy feel any better? Well, it didn't. And he didn't. He wouldn't change anything that had happened, but he'd wish that his teacher would have stopped looking at him like that. Still, Izuku nodded in agreement towards the man, his tongue feeling too thick to verbalize any thoughts or feelings. What could he really say to his teacher anyway without causing more problems about the whole issue? It's not like his feelings really mattered anyway, right? Aizawa-sensei wouldn't care. He didn't need to know. Izuku just needed to learn to keep things to himself and listen instead of whining all the time. And yet, even as he stayed silent, this earned a frown from Aizawa-sensei, who only stared at Izuku for a moment longer before he too simply sighed and continued onward, towards the steps. They continued walking, Izuku feeling a twinge of guilt as he recalled the frown on his teacher's lips. The school was mostly silent as Shoyuta and his student made their way inward, heading down the long hall, and towards the back entrances. The shined floors glistened in the light as the large windows dripped with sunshine and cast a warm glow along the walkway as the pair made a silent maneuver through the emptiness and towards the destination. All the while, Shoyuta stood carefully, thoughts drawn to the simple things he'd noticed so far as he basked in the silence that stretched heavily between them. It was almost stifling. No, it wasn't a comfortable silence by any stretch. Not hardly. Shoyuta was more than aware what would happen the minute he opened his mouth. This was Midoriya after all. He knew well enough that the boy was 15 degrees higher strung and stressed than anyone else he'd ever met. Which was a feat considering who Shoyuta actually bore as acquaintances, who he'd fought alongside. The stories and memories he shared with others. And yet, the kid trumped them all with his oddly unique terror and anxiety that swallowed thoughts and consumed reason, as he tromped after Shoyuta, caught up in his own world and in his own cares. An angry storm cloud seemed to hang over the boy's head as he stared vacantly into the nothingness, worry etched on his forehead and crinkled around his eyes. Cares that still rippled towards others because they were about others, as Shoyuta could see. But cares that also spoke of things that the boy seemed hesitant to speak out in the open or admit to, which piqued Shuta's curiosity and forced him into speculation of darker things, as he attempted to connect dots between behavior and lack of self-care on the boy's part. The man carefully dug his hands deeper into his pockets as he hummed lowly into his capture weapon, ruminating on the notion of the boy's assumptions that he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. That he was somehow in trouble. Always in trouble, it seemed. Which is certainly an oddity, the man mused as they drew nearer the large metal doors. Another oddity. Another question. Another comment that showed the gaps in just how much, or how little, Shoyuta recognized about Problem Child. Izuku. Why are you here, Midoriya? Izuku couldn't deny that he'd been more than a little surprised when they'd entered Gym Gamma. He also couldn't deny that he was even more surprised to see Shinso sitting near the mats, stretching his legs, and sporting his gym clothes. And it seemed that Shinso was just as surprised to see him, turning a quizzical glare Izuku's way when he registered the sound of the large, metal doors creaking open, disrupting the silence. Even with his headphones on, it seemed that the voiceover quirker was always aware of his surroundings, head snapping up at the slightest change, when the pair had walked in. A brief frown tipped at the boy's mouth as he moved to stand from the mat, removing his headphones and tucking them back into their case as he peered between Izuku and Aizawa-sensei. Izuku wasn't sure how he should answer or if he should answer since Hitoshi wasn't really asking what Izuku was doing in the gym so much as just voicing his dislike of the situation. Sensei? The amaranthan-haired boy furrowed his brows towards the man, a question lingering in the unfinished in that sentence, as the underground hero only folded his arms and leaned easily against the closed gym doors as a reply. Izuku didn't miss the way Aizawa-sensei's boot gently nudged him forward either, nearly tumbling into the mats as he tried to right himself at the last second. Aizawa-sensei gave another small huff, as the metal door clattered firmly into place. The underground hero was effectively trapping them in. I asked Midoriya to come because both of you need some additional combat training and the class dynamic wasn't cutting it. Izuku stiffened at the comment, feeling the warmth blossom on the back of his neck and curl around his ears as Shinso's eyes flickered back towards Izuku, a simple huff on his lips as he shuffled his feet gently. Hands slipped into pockets as Shinso tilted his head and sniffed lightly. I don't see why he needs to be here though, the boy remarked, his amethyst eyes turned to studying the rafters as he tilted his gaze upwards. The barest hints of annoyance tickled Shinso's tone as he continued to speak. He's Mr. Power Quirk. Golden Boy. It's not like he's deficient in hero prowess or anything. Izuku didn't miss the jab leveled at him and the obvious snide criticism of Izuku's, well, All Might's quirk as Shinso spoke. Nothing but a power type. That's all Izuku was. But Izuku couldn't even use his own quirk properly. The boy felt a burble of shame filter through his embarrassment as he stared on silently, uncertain if he should even say anything as Shinso continued to speculate about Izuku's need for being there to help train. Not that it's your quirk to use anyway, Izuku? The boy hastily shoved down the doubt and swallowed back his hurt at the realization that this wasn't so different from Aldera and he wasn't so different than he had been in junior high. And maybe it wasn't even his quirk to use at all. Maybe that's what Shinso was pointing out in the first place too. People seemed to dislike Izuku because he was Izuku. And that stung far more than the boy wanted to admit. A power type, true, but he is lacking in precision and diversity in his tactical approach. Aizawa-sensei cut in smoothly, stepping past Izuku with a soft hand ghosting over the boy's shoulder as he walked past the child and made towards the cupboard. Long, pale fingers curled around a keychain, keys jangling in his hand as he turned towards Shinso again with a tilt of his head back to Izuku. His injuries from the forest training are proof of his need for greater practice, just as your scars on your arms and legs are yours, correct? Sharp, violet eyes turned towards Izuku, who felt very much like he was being shoved under a magnifying glass for studying, as Shinso stared him down, almost challenging the green-haired boy to question him about what Aizawa-sensei had just said about his own scars on his arms and legs. Scars just like Izuku's. Though perhaps not. Perhaps a different kind, the green-haired child mused to himself, thoughts straying as he assessed the situation. An inkling of a thought and a worry crept up the green-eyed child's spine as he stewed. Perhaps they were scars from something darker, more cruel than Shinso would want to admit to. Really, too, Izuku was many things, but he wasn't so stupid to think that it was a smart idea to say anything, or even venture to bond over something so stupidly personal. Not that Izuku would ever want to. He knew what type of pain and frustration it meant to have. Those types of scars. Reminders of failure, mistakes, being too slow or too weak. And Izuku wasn't about to bring that up with Hitoshi. He didn't want the other boy to feel like what he was going through was somehow bad or that he was weak because of it. Aizawa-sensei strode closer to the wall and leaned into the door he'd unlocked, reaching into the closet, head leaning into the cupboard. It makes both of you predictable, which makes both of you a liability to others and yourselves. The man's voice was muffled behind the woodwork as he leaned into the closet, clearly searching for something as the sound of heavy metal bars clattering echoed in the stillness, the underground hero's unintelligible murmuring following close behind. Izuku hastily planted his vision towards his crimson shoes, willing the floor to swallow him at being called out for his failings. He knew he'd been too predictable and too inexperienced and too weak to really make a difference in what had happened that day in the forest. Or any of the times before. The warmth from the boy's neck traveled to his cheeks as Izuku's palms started to grow slick, his own agitation rising as he considered his failings, the ones that he thought were not so obvious to others. Had you just been a little faster, a treacherous voice whispered in the back of his mind, making it all the worse to think about. The memories, the sights and smells and darker thoughts swirled around the boy as he remembered. Kaken wouldn't have been captured and All Might wouldn't have. It had been his fault, hadn't it? If he'd been faster, better and more skilled, then he wouldn't have had to worry anyone and All Might wouldn't have had to do anything like he did. Midoriya has power, obviously. The man's head peered out from the closet as he frowned towards Shinso and then Izuku. But that won't make up for lack of skill. Just as your manipulation with your quirk won't save you from lack of skill in fighting in close quarters. The man shook his head as Shinso bowed his face towards the man in agreement, his silence an indication that he wasn't going to argue anymore, but his glower a clear indication, at least to Izuku, that he didn't agree with what Aizawa-sensei had to say about him. Especially when it came to comparing him to Izuku, it seemed. But Aizawa-sensei didn't seem to care, as he continued to frown, catching Izuku's curious, but wary gaze with his own assessing one. And as it stands, both of you need to work on precision and footwork. And the underground hero shook his head lightly as he reached back into the closet, rolling his eyes for a minute as he muttered to himself. Both of you ought to learn to fight without your quirks for various reasons. Then Aizawa-sensei brought out 2 long, wooden swords, a forceful toss launching the object towards each boy. Startled, Izuku stepped back and caught the sword awkwardly, his fingers sparking green as One for All ignited briefly. Izuku's heart hammered wildly in his chest at the thought of what the hell was he doing as his knuckles took the brunt of the abuse from the wooden weapon, his mind struggling to catch up to what his sensei meant by giving this to him here and now. But Aizawa-sensei didn't seem the least bit interested in saying or doing anything by way of explaining what these swords meant and why the actual hell they had to use them. The boy almost thought foolishly that maybe they were playing some sort of stupid sparring game, like Izuku would when he was a kid. Stick in hand, grin slip wide. So Izuku stood there, dumbly for a minute, grasping the sword like an idiot, until Aizawa-sensei closed the closet doors with a sound, thwop, before he straightened and faced his students. Let's get started. It was much easier teaching 2 students than 20, Shoyuda would admit to that. But no less tedious. And frankly, things were only easier in terms of the number of people he had to worry about. But, between Shinso and Midoriya, 2 was too many in some instances. There were still many small things to consider, watch for, and scrutinize. Precision was all about consistency and easy maneuvering. You have to be aware of yourself and your surroundings at all times. And in this case, at least, Shoyuda could get far more specific with what he'd seen and how well each of his students performed their tasks under pressure. Yes, 2 was easier than 20. Sort of. That was precisely what the man was doing now. Or trying to. The man stood brooding, staring intently from the sideline of the larger mats, upper body leaning against the large post as he watched the scene unfold. With each blink, each step, and movement, Shoyuda watched his teaching replayed through the actions of his students. Or a strange attempt at it anyway. Your footing is off, Midoriya. The underground hero observed the 2 boys carefully as they went through their paces, each student taking a turn at lunging towards their opponent, before utilizing a parry and then a feint to disengage with one another. Steps 1, then 2, then 3 in quick succession. Both expected to hold their swords, and both expected to move their feet in the proper way as they sparred. It was simple enough, right? These weren't complicated movements. Everything Shoyuda expected the pair to do were standard, generic sword fighting techniques. But the standard part is what made them useful techniques, especially for those needing practice in agility and controlling the strength of their blows, as these two did. The movements also train the boys to work on lean muscle growth as well as footing and reaction time. Plus, the lack of quirk usage forced the two to consider close combat and defensive strategies. "Midoriya, your footing is still off," their teacher called out again, watching as the boy nearly tripped over himself, with a step awkwardly placed crooked and stumbling. The chastisement from his sensei elicited an embarrassed mewl from the green-haired kid and a smirk from his lavender-haired counterpart as Izuku Midoriya straightened once more and adjusted his grip on his sword. The child shifted his feet, left foot jutting out, and right foot turning to point more forward as the boy concentrated on Shura's advice. "Weiss, sensei," Problem Child remarked after a moment of tense blinking and awkward. "Not so perfect after all," Shinso muttered, brow quirked and smirk fixed upward and ghosting his mouth as Midoriya ducked his head. "Figures. Now that's enough of that." Shoyuta-sen. Disapproving frown towards the taller student, his own brow quirked in questioning as he attempted to silently convey what he wanted the child to understand without him having to declare it outright and blatantly. Thankfully, it seemed that his students were smart enough to at least grasp the basics of implication and unsaids, and Shinso gave a sheepish grin in reply to Shura's silent rebuke of his remarks, leaning on his wooden weapon and rubbing his hand gently behind his head, seeming to ignore the silent reprimand, or at least deflect away from his own embarrassment for the time being. "I still don't understand why we have to do this anyway, teach," Shinso remarked with a wide grin, eyes glinting dangerously in expectation for Shura's reply. He was challenging the man, egging him on and baiting him. Beneath that, however, Shoyuta could see that hesitation, and that mark of fear perhaps was it? Hitoshi was always somewhat afraid to ask the real questions, Shoyuta found, and so he'd attack them in roundabout ways. Midoriya's own eyes were wide, but he'd chosen to stay silent, unwilling to overstep his bounds as the third party to this conversation. He seemed to understand Shinso's nature and intention, even if the amethyst-eyed boy didn't quite see it yet himself. The kid was wise, Shoyuta would give him that. Because, beneath the biting criticism and Shinso's questioning, the man could see, and he suspected Midoriya could as well, the briefest flickers of vulnerability, and he knew that boy was concerned, debating why Shoyuta was unwilling to teach Shinso how to use a capture weapon just yet after he'd promised. There was always that layer of mistrust between the pair of them, and Shoyuta could see the way the boy seemed to weigh the truthfulness of the man's every intention, questioning if he'd ever be believed or cared about. And more importantly, the boy was concerned about Midoriya's presence in what had been their private training sessions. Why bring in a kid who already had immense offensive power? Why set Shinso up for that level of potential embarrassment, which was not what Shoyuta intended at all? But convincing the kid of that was going to be a challenge. As much of a challenge as convincing the first kid that they were capable of that offensive power and defensive positioning. That was the other variable in this mess of studying. Izuku was the other one, the problem child who had more secrets and peculiarities than any other student he'd ever dealt with. Go through your paces again, and this time focus on keeping your feet at a 30-degree angle to promote better balance, Midoriya. Shinso, make sure you practice the pressure you put into your lunges. You're lacking in force and momentum, which causes too much pushback when you're facing an opponent. Right. Midoriya gave a nod towards his teacher, face pinched in determination, as it was Shinso's turn to look perturbed by Aizawa's assessment. Lavender eyes narrowed for a moment in questioning as Hitoshi tried to register what Shoyuta meant and what he was saying regarding the boy's movements and capabilities. Abilities which were less than perfect, as Shinso had criticized of Midoriya just a moment ago. However, the other boy only nodded curtly in reply, biting comments silent behind his teeth, before turning a narrowed gaze back to the verdant-haired hero in training, his rival. They started up again, each skiing in a low breath before charging towards the center of the mat as Aizawa nodded in approval before ducking out the door. The clattering of wood swords striking against his ears in a pleasing reassurance that the pair were actually following his instructions. Of course, when he'd returned after fetching a few bottles of water, their teacher could feel the way the room dropped a few degrees as the two squared off. And really, he should have known this is what was going to happen. 2 weeks of doling out practice sessions with Shinso, and knowing Midoriya's penchant for incessant questions, he was certain that Shinso's patience would be tested. More than certain, actually. He was right. I don't understand why we need to do this, Hitoshi groused again, panting slightly as he flexed his fingers and shifted his sword from side to side. The boy's gaze trained on the other, shorter boy who stood, clearly focusing his attention on his footwork, as he'd been instructed, as he continued to glare. Or why I have to do this with you of all people. They hadn't noticed Shuta's return, it seemed, which could prove useful for the man as he continued to stare at the. I didn't volunteer for this, Midoriya remarked quietly in return, panting lightly as he adjusted the grip on his own blade. But it's not a bad idea for us to train like this, you know? Quirkless combat is useful when we don't have the ability to effectively use our powers, or if they'd be more of a danger than a benefit. Shinso observed Midoriya's movements for a moment, as the other prattled on about the practicality of the exercise, before he took the opportunity to lunge forward, bearing down his opponent's wooden blade with a forceful strike that left the smaller boy straining from the angle of the blow as he was caught unaware. Or so it seemed. It was a cheap tactic, and Shinso was clearly using his height to his advantage, which was smart, Shoyuta noted, but it was effective enough to get the job done, so Shoyuta couldn't really fault the boy for his choice to lunge when he had. You don't have to explain it to me, Midoriya, the purple-haired boy bit out. I'm not stupid. The boy bore down and continued to bite out towards the other kid. You don't have to keep chattering about everything that comes into your dmed head. I don't need to hear it. And that was fair enough considering how much of a problem it was causing Izuku right now. Especially when he'd warned Problem Child of his distractibility before. But Midoriya was no slouch and easily pivoted away from Shinso's strike, pulling his shoulder back and turning into a half-step as he managed to pull his own blade out of the blow. In a fluid twist, the boy ducked beneath Shinso's renewed strike and continued to backtrack to give some distance and reassert his bearings. Midoriya grinned, half-hearted as it was, his voice dying in his throat as he raised his own blade and bent his knees, pressing into the ball of his feet. There was a tense half-second of a breath and a challenging, assessing flash that glinted in the bottle-green gaze, before the boy was springing forward and lunging, swinging the sword downward, against Shinso's weapon. The force of his blow much fiercer than the one against him had been as the two weapons struck violently against one another. Shinso was rocked back, his legs shaking awkwardly as the weight and presence of the strike beat against his own, weaker defense. Midoriya had the upper hand. A stronger opponent who pressed his shoulder downward, into the blow, and let the full brunt of force bear down on Shinso's grip. It only lasted a moment, though, before Shinso managed to pull himself out of Midoriya's range, as he spun backwards and ripped his sword back and downward in a swooping slice that cut the air between them and split the connection as Izuku pitched forward slight and Shinso tipped back. The taller boy winced and glowered as he shook his hand to free it from the aftershock of Midoriya's hit. There was a low hiss as he tried to flex his fingers and adjust from the blow. And there was the dynamic again, made more apparent the longer the two were at their bickering and striking. Izuku was the stronger offensive fighter, Shinso the faster and more precise defensive one, though that margin was starting to diminish between the two the longer they sparred together. Problem Child was getting faster as he analyzed each move his opponent made and started to concentrate less on the precision of his movements as they became more habitual with each pass. Shinso too was getting stronger, marginally fueled by his own agitation with the other boy, and the whole process of practicing against someone that he felt intimidated by. Shinso was turning his own determination to get better and show Midoriya especially that he'd made improvement, seemed enough to encourage a bit of progress. And yet, for all their positive attributes, why are you holding back from hitting at me? Midoriya's voice cut through the man's thoughts with a clarity that had the man straightening. It was quite the accusation to make against someone, and Shoyuta quirked a surprised brow towards the pair, shifting his attention from Midoriya and then to Shinso, watching how Shinso's face contorted into a look of utter annoyance at the call-out. His eyes flashed dangerously at the freckled face across from him. "Oh, this would get interesting." "I'm not holding back," Shinso spat in reply, "and just because you have a fancy quirk doesn't mean you can lecture me on my use of strength." But that's not true, Shinso, Midoriya pressed, his voice soft, but firm, his verdant eyes steely and certain. Aizawa briefly contemplated the reasoning behind the kid's determination to expose Shinso's lie, the same he noticed, but refrained in favor of observing for a moment longer. You are holding back. You're not trying to hit at your full force whenever we do the passing strikes. You pull back at the last second. It was certainly interesting what was happening. Shoyuta could see the way Shinso's eyes flashed at the accusation. Because both kids were hiding something from the other, but Problem Child seemed to be the only one perceptive enough to notice it or care. And I don't know why you're not willing to fight me at your full strength, Midoriya continued. Don't you want to get better at this and show everyone that? This isn't a game for me, golden boy, Shinso remarked darkly. I'm not looking for a friend to lecture me on my use of strength or abilities, so just butt out. Izuku frowned, grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. Shoyuta could see the way the boy's shoulders tensed in anticipation for what was going to happen next if he continued to purposefully bait Shinso. And he was purposely baiting him. Nevertheless, the boy did continue to press the conversation and make the accusations against the taller kid. I'm only trying to help, Midoriya continued, frowning at Shinso. I know that you're looking to transfer into the hero course. Midoriya, stop. And I know that you've had a lot of training, but other people think your quirk isn't practical for it. And really you can do it if you wanted, and if you worked hard enough at it. Mido. The green-haired boy continued to prattle on, trying to emphasize his point and ensure that Shinso understood that he saw the potential in the other's ability to achieve his goal. A goal that the boy had never dared to speak aloud. But, Problem Child being who he was, the boy had figured it out quite easily. Which clearly seemed to piss Shinso off, who tilted his head and narrowed his eyes at the other boy, frown deepening with each word that fell from Midoriya's lips. But, if you're able to master some other techniques, then I know that you'll be able to. Just shut up, you med teacher's pet. Shinso ground out as he lunged again toward Midoriya, teeth bared. Clearly the verdant-haired boy had struck a nerve. You're not as f***ing smart as you think you are, so stop trying to show off. But Shoyuta didn't think that it was Midoriya was necessarily trying to show off anything, as he turned his upper half into a semi-twist and pivoted his hips before lowering his shoulder and catching the wooden sword with his own, elbows bending to brace against the weight of Shinso's forceful blow. Shoyuta knew enough about Izuku Midoriya now to know the boy wasn't really the show-off type, but rather just a repository of random knowledge that seemed to spring up from. Well, Shoyuta wasn't quite sure how Problem Child knew so much as he frowned and considered the implications of the boy's intense knowledge of quirks and tactical battle particulars. You don't get to lecture me, Shinso snapped again, as he pulled back and did a quick change of his hand positioning, knees bending and arms turning as he angled his practice sword towards Midoriya's face. You don't get to accuse me of anything. I'm working with you on this stupid practice, aren't I? The boy took another step forward, springing from the ball of his feet and swinging the sword upward this time, catching Problem Child's hilt with the center of his own wooden blade. The force of the blow much stronger than the previous had been, a stark reminder that Midoriya had been right. Izuku was knocked backwards, falling hard onto his rear as Shinso pressed his advantage in speed, as the green-haired boy scrambled to his feet and brought his sword up again to defend. Amaranthine eyes bore into the other as the taller boy brought his weight into his blows more forcefully now, striking repeatedly, pressuring Midoriya's footfalls to falter and knocking him over again. You don't get to call me weak, Midoriya. But Izuku was also quick to recover, and managed to roll out of Shinso's strike zone before another blow would or could land, stumbling to his feet, knuckles white against the tanned wood of his hilt as he adjusted his stance to better as blood trickled from the boy's knuckled, deep red welts smarting against the white of the boy's hands as he bent his knees to balance himself. You were stronger in the sports festival, came the low reply. And, oh, that was a goading reply, wasn't it? It surprised Shoyuta that Midoriya, of all people the most affable and compassionate kid in the class, would make such a remark, clearly intending to PSS off his opponent. And it was working. Funny, I was going to say the same for you, came a biting retort from the taller of the two, as it was Shinso's turn to brace for Midoriya's blow. The shorter kid didn't hold back on his assault and landed two massive strikes against the other's wooden weapon, forcing a grunt from Shinso, whose arms shook at the force of the kid's strike had him stumbling backwards, nearly knocking him off the mat entirely. Midoriya was gaining speed, having assessed Shinso's ability to sidestep and dance around the maneuvers in a wide berth. So Problem Child had started to mimic the moves, using only his keen analysis to integrate the fluidity of the sidestep into his dancing footwork to enhance his own prowess as he charged around Shinso and then launched another attack, pulling downward and then moving up in a hard swipe that barreled into Shinso's sword and upended his resistance, pushing the boy's upper half tilting backwards as Izuku made another quick pullback and then drew his sword around and brought it up and down. Hard to force Shinso onto his back. There was another low groan, as Hitoshi turned on his side and rolled to his knees, fingers curled around the hilt of his sword as a dribble of spit slipped down his chin. You think you can lecture me about how I use my strength when you're holding back from me as well? The boy lifted himself and turned to face his opponent, readying himself for another round, a wariness flickering in the boy's gaze for a brief moment as he peered at Izuku, who stood stock still and watched Shinso carefully. I'm not, Midoriya retorted as he rolled his shoulders, feinting to the left before pulling a spin, and lunging once more, pressing more weight into the front of his foot to give himself more elevation and more speed as he launched again and rammed into Shinso, who was ready for him this time, a stiff resistance and a pushback hold against Izuku's blow as Shinso used his height to press his advantage and knocked Izuku to the side, stumbling into a pile of stacked mats near the corner of the practice area. I'm not holding back from you. Then attack me with your actual strength, you moron. Shinso spat, charging forward again as Problem Child tried to right himself. Why don't you use that stupid quirk and get this over with rather than pretending that this training is anything close to what you want to be doing there, golden boy? Izuku stumbled again as Hitoshi's form loomed closer, a charged press forward as the boy's glower zeroed in on Izuku, his sword raised. Surprise washed over Izuku, his own sword nearly slipping from his grip as Hitoshi's snide comments replayed in his head, over and over and over again. Just use that stupid quirk and get this over with. Golden boy. What? Shinso took the opportunity to wrap his own blade against the other kid's knuckles before bringing his elbow out and catching Izuku in the chin, sending the boy stumbling as the taste of copper filled his mouth. But Izuku barely registered the flash of pain and the spatter of red that splashed against his lips and mouth, as he blinked a few times to steady his vision and adjust his analysis of the situation, observing his opponent carefully as he pulled himself further back, hopping a few feet away and tucking his sword closer to himself. Easy, children. Watch your form. Shinso was panting, a clear wave of frustration washing over his features as he stood across from Izuku's still form, waiting for Izuku to do something. Lash out? Heck? What was it? But Midoriya was confused. Why would he? Is that what you really think? That I would want to hold back or didn't care about this fight? He queried of the other, pale boy before him. Listen, I wouldn't have agreed to this exercise if I didn't. Oh, spare me, Shinso retorted lowly. I don't need you pretending to be my friend, golden boy. You don't give a shit about me or what I'm going through. What I have to do. Shinso took a step towards Izuku, who tensed, readying himself. It's not like that, Hitosh. Don't use my name, Midoriya. We aren't friends. And you Dmed hero types are all the FING same. The boy took another step as Izuku braced for another blow, the strike landing with more force than he'd been expecting, which confirmed what he'd known from the start, that Histoshi had been holding. You hero types are all alike. You think you know everything about everyone and give advice no one wants. But you know nothing, you a-hole. The boy kicked at Izuku's knee and rammed into Izuku's shin, eliciting a hiss from the shorter boy, who pulled back as he tried to assert some stability, his arm back to keep his sword in his grip, and taking a strike to his shoulder instead. You Dmed, you just rely on your powers and don't actually care for the hard work that others have to put in. It's always so easy for you. Another blow had the boy knocked sideways, and Izuku wanted to snort at Shinso's comment as the two continued their dance, because it was absurd to level that charge at Midoriya. Not that Shinso would know that. Not that anyone would know that. As it was, he elected to dodge Shinso's next blow, feinting to his right and pulling himself low and beneath Shinso's swing as he turned a wide rotation and pulled a wide circle. "You don't know what I've had to work at," he managed to murmur in return, shifting away from Shinso's next attempt at a powerful downward sword strike. "I still don't have full control of my power yet." "And whose fault is that?" "It's a shitty excuse." The violet eyes narrowed on Izuku as the boy smirked in annoyance. "It's no one's problem if the golden boy didn't take the time to practice his own quirk and build up an understanding of it." Izuku grunted and pressed as much of his own weight and energy into pushing Hitoshi off of him and lobbying to do an undercut again, pulling lower this time than he had the last, using his lack of height to his own advantage to get at Hitoshi's stomach. The hilt of Izuku's practice sword made a firm connection with the soft flesh of the other boy's middle, and Hitoshi let out a choked wheeze as he was rocked backwards, dropping his sword as Izuku pivoted to the right again and stepped backwards, dancing into a wider berth as the boy coughed on the floor. I don't expect anyone to care about my quirk," Izuku panted as a trickle of sweat slithered down his back. "I didn't ask anyone to help with my quirk. But this isn't about any of that. It's about training. Training are? Just save it, Midoriya. There's no R. I'm not like you." Hitoshi choked out with a cough. "It's not about anything to do with this sheet right here." The kid smacked a foot against the mat, resting an arm on this knee as he coughed again. "You've just coasted because you were born with a heroic quirk and told that you'd be a hero no matter what. Spoon-fed the same sheet that everyone loves to feed the glory hogs. Some of us aren't as lucky. And oh, wasn't that rich? You idiot." The words fell from Izuku's mouth with little thought, as memories flashed like bombs through his senses, each one bright and angry and furiously bitter. The longing he'd felt, wanting a quirk, anything to just be included, just a part of the classes. The dream to just be a hero, to save others, to want to do something good. The loneliness and rejection. The laughter. That didn't matter. But Hitoshi just didn't understand. He didn't get it. "You think that I'd spend any time training with someone I didn't respect?" The boy snapped, his thoughts swirling into the fortune he'd been given, the quirk he'd been lucky enough to have because someone like All Might saw that he had a little bit of a chance. "I don't look down on you, Shinso," the boy continued, with an angry rejection burbling. "I think you're a strong opponent." He was more than strong, really. And his quirk was really, really useful. But he just didn't see it. Izuku blew out an angry breath, trying to quell the frustration and the rejection. Because it was always like this, always something about Izuku that just set people off. And they never understood. "And you don't know half of what I've been through, so don't accuse me of not understanding when you've not taken the time to understand me either, Hitoshi." Shoyuta watched the way Midoriya's eyes flashed as he took the offensive this time, despite his slight disadvantage in height and speed. The kid's movements were coiled, tight, and far more precise as he leveled a powerful lunging strike down on Shinso's blade, forcing the taller boy to stumble. But, instead of pulling back and allowing the spar to go into the counter, as he had prior, Problem Child brought on an advanced assault, striking once, and then twice more as he turned the wooden practice sword in his grip towards the side and angled another hard strike into the Shinso's arm, followed by a return to the downward swipe that had the taller boy slamming to the ground, before he finally pulled back as Shinso kicked at Midoriya's shins to put him off balance long enough to roll. "But you don't know anything about me, Hitoshi," the verdant-haired child continued to snap at the other boy, charging again. Shoyuta could feel a distinct shift in the air as a warning chimed in the back of his mind. Something was different, something deeper hinting in the boy's words as he lobbied for another blow to Shinso's still sensitive arm. "You don't know anything about what my life was like before UA or how I was treated. I don't need to know that you were probably told the same bullshit lies that all you glory chasers are, that you could do no wrong, that you were the perfect hero material, and taught to look down on others like me who weren't so lucky. You've been pampered and coddled since you were a child. It was also so easy for you." "It wasn't easy for me," Midoriya retorted, a heated spark of words slipping from his lips. "And I know that you don't believe that I care if you get into the hero course or not, but I do understand what it's like." "You couldn't possibly understand what it's like for someone like me, Midoriya," Shinso spat back as he shoved Problem Child backwards, hands shifting away from guarding with his weapon and using the force of his own weight to ram into the other boy. "You're nothing like me. I've had to listen to all the lies, and all the shit that others said about it. But I do get it." Midoriya sidestepped and hastily swiped at his face, trying to stem the flow of crimson from his mouth as he brought his sword up again. "I didn't have a lot either, and I—" "Bullshit, golden boy. You've had everything. You've had everyone wrapped around your diamond finger since the minute you set foot on this campus." Shoyuda narrowed his eyes at Shinso's words and stewed at the perplexed look that crossed Problem Child's face, abject confusion swirling as the boy tried to register the utter lie that was Shinso's comment. "That's not true." A sound smack with the hilt of the sword to Izuku's chin had him grunting and stumbling backwards, hands splaying outward in an awkward attempt to balance everything as tears slipped from the boy's eyes. It had to hurt, Shoyuda knew, as the chiming sound continued to echo in his mind. "Boys. And what would I care if you are liked or not, golden boy?" Hitoshi snapped as he pushed forward again, trying to get another swipe at Izuku while he was distracted from trying to stymie the new flow of blood that spilled from his mouth. "You've been given everything." "I haven't." "Shinso, Midoriya?" The pair weren't listening to anything but themselves now as Shoyuda took a step forward, assessing the best way to intervene before things got too out of hand. It was clear that a nerve had been struck and the pair were reeling, Shinso more than Izuku, though that didn't surprise the man. "That's enough. And I bet your mother and father just doted on you, didn't they?" This was a sore subject for Shinso as he taunted Izuku and tried to land another blow, bringing his practice blade down to meet Midoriya's with a sound, thwack, of wood striking wood. "Pampered you and let you just dream about all the things you'd have as a hero? My mom didn't." Shoyuda reached for his capture weapon, ready to cast out the gray as the pair continued to dance around each other, each feinting and gripping their swords tightly, ready to come to blows again. "And why wouldn't she?" Shinso cut in again, clearly not believing Izuku's refutation as he glowered at the other boy. A bruise was growing on his cheek where he'd been smacked by a wayward strike earlier. "You've got the power and everyone's loved you since the first day and you've never struggled." "I was quirkless, you idiot." A micro-explosion seemed to deafen the area, sending Shuda's senses into a shroud of silence as his own movements still entirely from shock at the statement that echoed from Problem Child's lips. "I was quirkless. What the hell?" And just as quickly as the outburst escaped the boy's lips, bottle-green orbs hardened, and the boy's mouth snapped shut as Izuku Midoriya charged forward, eyes narrowed with a fury that Shoyuda had never quite seen in the boy's gaze before. It was concerning, not only because of what anger he expected to find, but because of the complete hurt that lingered in that look and the forlorn expression that almost spoke of a lost little boy desperately trying to hide himself away from being so brutally honest. "I was quirkless. And it was an oddity." Shuda's fingers twitched, an ache tingling through them as he laced his hand through his capture weapon and assessed once more, straining to comprehend and catch up as he reeled from Midoriya's claim. "Don't lie to me." Shinso spat in reply. "I'm not stupid and I told you I wasn't looking for your pity or your friendship. You can't expect me to believe. I didn't even lie." The shorter boy retorted bitterly, the anger marred by a hoarseness in his voice as the emotion cracked his words. "I didn't get my DMed quirk until the entrance exam, you moron, so don't tell me what I do or don't know about what it feels like to be pushed down by others." And then Midoriya was moving again, the smaller boy pressing his weight into a leap as he sprinted forward, at his opponent, and unleashed a flurry of assaults against Shinso, who had to dodge the slew of blows with a series of parries and a feint in anticipation. Shuda's grip on the capture weapon tightened and his mouth fell open in mild surprise at what his student was claiming as he snapped another swipe at Shinso, this time angling low and going for an uppercut strike that caught the taller boy's forearm with a hard thwack that had the boy hissing as he tipped and parried, catching Midoriya's sword above his own as he shoved the boy's weapon upward and out of the way, sidestepping and pulling out of ranging again. The entrance exam? The man's thoughts latched onto the sheer strangeness of the comment. Because he couldn't make sense of it. It was so unlikely. It's nearly impossible for that to happen. So rare for someone to have such a delayed quirk manifestation. And he'd never reported it. It didn't make sense. It was so improbable and so unlikely that it was less likely to be true that Shoyuta being Midoriya's father, which he wasn't, but it was more plausible than what he was hearing. And yet, if Midoriya was telling the truth? But why would the boy lie? This was just a sparring match, so why would the kid lie to get a win in? That didn't sound like something Midoriya would do. He wasn't that petty. Shoyuta frowned as he wanted the pair continue to dance around one another, Shinso shaking out his arm to ease the ache that, no doubt, was lingering from the repeated blows that had been landed, and Problem Child hastily wiping the sweat from his hands onto his pants as blood continued to drip down his chin, sweat making his hair stick awkwardly to his neck. Izuku Midoriya was incredibly honest. Almost to a fault, really. He had no reason to lie about something like this, and certainly not for something as small as winning a sparring match. Why wait until it was just two other people if that were the case? Why not make this accusation when others were watching, when it was a more important fight? Because it's the truth, undoubtedly. And that made Shoyuta still for a moment as a hot spark of regret washed over him from several choices he'd made on behalf of Izuku Midoriya, the comments that came so naturally, so quickly, and casually because he'd become so comfortable teaching the same way to the same type of students. Quirk holders who should have a handle on their power because they'd had it for years. And then comes this boy, who claims to only have had his quirk for a few hours and a few days? And Problem Child had listened and taken each chastisement to heart, and each criticism with a solemn and quiet resolve, never mentioning this information prior, never caring to notify his sensei of what he was dealing with. Because of course he wouldn't. Of course he wouldn't deem that an important time to reveal his struggles. No, it had to be when he was sparring against another child who struggled to see himself as a viable asset to the hero course, which seemed to piss Midoriya off because he was that kid too, wasn't he? Of course. And really, so much made sense to Shoyuta now: the deflection, the hesitancy to accept praise and censure, the skittishness, the utter lack of self-preservation. Because if the kid had been quirkless and treated even half as poorly as Shinso had, the latter having confided in him after months of careful one-on-one time, then Izuku Midoriya bore more than just physical scars. F.I.N.G. hell. Of course they'd both be the same in their backgrounds and in their pain. The man's eyes narrowed as he watched Shinso step closer to Midoriya, preparing himself to strike again. Of course they'd both have suffered. Damn it all. You've got to be joking, came Shinso's reply, though Shoyuta could tell it was far less annoyed and more confused in tone than it had been before. There was a beat of silence as the UA teacher observed the two fingers still tightly gripping the capture weapon, energy humming in his fingertips as he waited to see what would happen if he should intervene. Another beat of silence dropped, a heavy dewdrop of energy that slipped downward and splashed around them. And then Shinso's eyes widened marginally as he leveled his sword towards the ground in favor of staring at Midoriya, who was tense, feet planted and knees bent, waiting to spring forward at the slightest provocation. Well, sheet Midoriya, the boy breathed, his tone shifting, a thoughtful confusion swirling briefly before tilting his head in questioning towards the boy. That explains a lot about you. And, yeah, it did explain a lot. More than a lot, in truth. And Shoyuta felt the same acceptance of what the smaller boy claimed, as he and Shinso both stared at Midoriya, who looked a mixture of anger and resignation at his admittance of a secret so obviously tender and bitterly fresh. The anger slipped up, and for a brief moment, Shoyuta saw the rawness there, peeking through, before the child averted his gaze and let his own sword fall, hands gripping the hilt too tightly, knuckles bone-white as he pursed his lips. Yeah, Problem Child replied, quiet and gentle as the energy seemed to shift to carry the weight of the boy's regret as he spoke. I know what it's like, so don't tell me that I can't understand you. And don't feed me that line about your quirk not being suited for heroics. Midoriya lifted his head towards the slightly startled, orchid-eyed teen. Your power doesn't determine your worth. Your quirk doesn't make you a hero or a villain or a success. You do. The spark was there, the determination still peering through the hurt as he stared down Shinso. And it was a familiar speech that Shoyuta had heard many times before from the boy, as common as it was to hear him mutter and speculate and analyze. Shoyuta had heard the child's impassioned commentary repeated multiple times to multiple people the boy considered friends and worthy members of the hero course. The overly idealistic, dreamer language would have been off-putting from most others, dismissed as trite or fake if it had been anyone else. Anyone but Midoriya. The same boy who never spoke of himself that way, only ever speaking of others as worthy or good enough. You fought so hard in the sports festival, trying to prove yourself as worthy of recognition for the hero course. But now, Izuku waved his hands briefly, you're giving up halfway. You don't want to put your full power into fighting me because you're either scared, jealous, or both. Midoriya frowned at Shinso's still form, and Shoyuta focused his attention on the smaller teen, spying the tightness about the boy's eyes and mouth, recognizing the way his eyes flashed with a pain that he rarely let others see. I understand more than anyone what it feels like and what you've gone through. And I know that if you're going to fight, Hitoshi, Shoyuta knew that boy was intentionally using the other's name to show that he did still see the boy as a friend. Then you better give it your all or there's no point to trying to be a hero. Quirk or no. And well, that was true. And a ballsy comment to make, especially from this idealistic boy who stood at the ready, waiting for the chips to fall and the sheet to hit the fan if Shinso didn't take well to his comments, as he hadn't this entire time. And Shinso seemed to realize it as well. Which is why the other boy only pursed his lips and nodded once in deference to Izuku and readied his stance, lifting the ligneous weapon to the ready. The fight was going to commence. Shuta's fingers twitched again as his hand lowered slightly, grip loosening on his capture weapon. Then I won't hold back, he remarked simply. And then the boy was off, charging forward, rapid-fire footfalls propelling Shinso towards Midoriya who raised his sword to parry at the last second. The blow wasn't as strong as Izuku's might have been, but it was effective enough to throw the boy backwards into a hasty stumble that took a moment for the shorter child to right himself out of. Shinso followed that lunge with another straightforward strike, bearing down on the small boy who grit his teeth in concentration as his arms shook from the effort to keep Shinso away from him. It was apparent that Shinso had been holding back a great deal more than he'd wanted to let on. Out of reflex, Midoriya threw his leg outward and rammed a firm kick into Shinso's stomach, forcing a choked cough to escape the other as he tripped back and fell hard against the mat. Another exhale had the boy struggling to regain his breath. And then Midoriya was on Shinso like lightning, not bothering to wait for the other to regain any sense of coordination or air in his lungs. Shoyuta watched with a thoughtful expression, detecting the faintest shifts in each opponent's stance and attitude towards one another as another collision erupted between the pair. They'd gotten serious. Finally, with a grunt, Izuku stumbled, bearing the brunt of Shinso's hilt on his shoulder. This was followed by a swift kick towards the boy's stomach. And though Midoriya came away from the blow by rolling back and resting on his heels, he wasn't able to dodge the hilt of Shinso's weapon smacking into his nose with a loud crack. Ah well shit. Recovery Girl was going to give Shoyuta hell for this. The boy's nose was definitely broken. Droplets of sweat dripped from must curls as blood poured from the boy's nose as Problem Child wheezed in and rocked backward, his own sword swinging outward to rap against Shinso's ear in a half-swipe as the violet-haired child jerked away and hissed in annoyance at the close call. Another wheeze whistled as the green curls swayed and the boy lifted his head. Izuku Midoriya grinned towards Hitoshi Shinso, expression almost wild, excited and feral. Toxic green orbs flashed as the boy brought his weapon up to the ready position. Come on, is that it? Problem Child mocked lightly, a competitive edge lacing his words. I told you to give it your all. This Midoriya, Shoyuta noted, was far more confident and vocal than the anxious, self-critical teen that sat in his classroom every day. The competition was fueling his fire and tamping down the insecurities. At least for the time being, that is. Mostly because he has something to prove, the underground hero hummed to himself, thoughts switching between ideas, notions, details he'd started to collect and organize. He has someone to take care of. Someone else to focus on and save. Someone beside himself. And that knowledge hurt more than Shoyuta wanted to admit. But it seemed Problem Child's tactic was working, finally rubbing off on Shinso who grinned back lightly. Have it your way then, Izuku. And it was Shoyuta who smirked at Shinso's use of Midoriya's name. A final shift. Tentative acceptance. Problem Child was using his Demed friendship no jutsu technique on everyone, it seemed. Both boys charged at one another, swords raised in the familiar lunge, but at the last second Shinso feinted, dodged, and instead of putting his weight into striking down with his sword, he planted a firm kick into Midoriya's ribs, sending the boy off his feet and tumbling backwards, a hard smack against mat as his face turned towards the ceiling. And Shoyuta knew what was coming now. Izuku smacked into the mat with a whoosh, breath whispering through his lips, as he hastily struggled to his feet, sword gripped tightly in his hand as more blood dribbled down his face, eyes flashed in excitement as energy crackled around the pair. But Shinso was there to meet him, as Shoyuta knew he would be, his superior speed giving him the slightest leverage against the greater brute force of Midoriya's blow that came striking down on Shinso's blade. The underground hero's attention was pulled towards the intertwining of energies, the slightest shifting of footfalls and stances as he noted each movement with critical, calculating assessment. With a swift parry and a hastily planted sidestep, Hitoshi brought his sword back, swiveled his stance, allowing momentum to right the swing of his blade forward, to slam the broadside of the weapon into Midoriya's hip at the same moment that the blade of Problem Child's sword struck at his shoulder. But Shinso was quicker, and took the brunt of the blade with an angry hiss as he dipped low, borrowing Midoriya's earlier move of tucking smaller, before sweeping his leg out to knock the other boy flat onto his back. Izuku gave a choked gasp as Shinso placed the tip of his wooden blade at the other kid's throat. Yield. That's enough then, boys, Shoyuta called evenly, his voice schooled into careful control. Hitoshi's thoughts were all over the place as he panted heavily when Aizawa-sensei called for the end of the training. Only after Midoriya easily gave up, conceding defeat, dropping his sword at his side with hands gently raised and a grin on his face, and only after Aizawa had commented that they'd better finish up, did the taller teen flop down on the mat beside the verdant-haired opponent, both lapsing into a silence only broken by their heavy breathing. The thoughts were too loud though, each one pierced by the events of the morning, with the hazarded dollops of anger and regret mixing together as confusion overtook Hitoshi's resolve to dislike Midoriya's presence here, in this gym, sparring with him. The boy's lavender hair was stuck to his forehead in a haphazard way as he turned towards the freckled face of Izuku Midoriya, watching the way the kid's emerald eyes flickered critically, clearly in the process of analyzing what had just happened. But, in the blink of an eye, the smaller boy swiveled his attention towards Shinso, whose eyes widened at the appraisal he was receiving from the other boy again. And it was as wildly uncomfortable as it was unfamiliar to Hitoshi, which made it difficult to assess and deal with. I was quirkless. You're really quick on your feet, Midoriya remarked. The normally chipper tone returned to the boy's voice as he smiled widely as Hitoshi, clearly unperturbed by his loss. Clearly ignoring his own admittance of his own background and history that spoke of a life that hadn't been easy and hadn't been kind. Would you mind showing me how you can pivot so seamlessly? You seem to have a natural understanding of how your pacing ought to be, and I could use some help in building up speed and dexterity with my footwork. Shinso wasn't quite sure what to do with the praise and the query the boy, he'd thought of as a pretentious prick, was giving him. And really? Hitoshi found himself nodding as he searched the boy's face, searching for. He found it in Midoriya's eyes, buried beneath a shining cheerfulness. There was the same guarded expression swirling in those green orbs that matched the one Shinso wore on his face. Midoriya was just better at hiding it, it seemed, because it was still there. Buried deep, still harsh and biting and angry and festering. And still there. Still proving that Midoriya wasn't so perfect, and wasn't so different from Hitoshi. And it proved to Shinso that the kid hadn't been lying. They were a lot alike. All right, you two, that's enough for today. Yeah, the boy thought as he slowly lifted himself up to a sitting position, watching Midoriya wipe the blood from his nose onto his sleeve. Problem Child, I think your nose is broken. Yeah, this was more than enough for one day. Izuku tried to ignore the way Aizawa-sensei's eyes bore into him as he focused on his opponent. On Hitoshi, his smile still in place as he tried to ignore the weird tightness in his chest, and the way everything felt too warm and too bright. Because at least Hitoshi understood now, a little bit anyway, that he was good enough. Worthy. A hand on the boy's head had Izuku tilting his head upwards, to stare into his sensei's thoughtful gaze, that tightness in his chest continuing to make it difficult to swallow, to breathe, to think properly as the world closed in and the words echoed in his ears. I was quirkless. He'd been too honest. But it had helped Hitoshi. It had helped someone else. And now, Izuku didn't know what to think of himself, of where he stood with his sensei, with Hitoshi, with anyone or anything here at UA. Good job, problem child, the man murmured, his expression even, though not unkind as he leaned down and carefully placed a bottle of water in Izuku's vision. You both did good. The knots started to loosen, a different weight replacing the strained tension as the boy took the proffered water silently, doubts still swirling. You both did good. I was quirkless. At least, he'd helped Hitoshi. The boy smiled again, more to himself this time as he wiped at his face. At least he'd done that. Prologue. It was getting harder to breathe. The air felt thick as time seemed to slow. Every pant, every inhale was sharp and loud in Izuku's ears as the world seemed to grow, the space around him expanding ever larger, more expansive. Blood trickled down the boy's cheek just beneath his eye, as the world tilted dangerously, colors twisting and melting together as dizziness consumed him. Anger beat in his veins, one for all echoing his frustration, pulsing and waiting for him to use the reserved energy. Fear and confusion twisted in his stomach. Did you really think it wasn't all connected? The man's breath was close, near Izuku's ear, as he tried to inhale, tried to move. You can't tell me that you weren't to blame for this. The comment felt like a slap to the face even though he couldn't say it wasn't true. Izuku stood there trying to stop his legs from trembling, his quirk sparking angrily and out of control as he struggled to see clearly through the dust and the haze, every muscle protesting against being frozen, every particle of one for all straining against the pressure that held him bound. There'd never been a moment to stop, to breathe, to slow down and just stand still. To think. And now that's all he could do, even though he didn't want to. He couldn't breathe but couldn't stop the thoughts, couldn't escape them, couldn't do anything. The man in front of Izuku scoffed as he moved away from the boy, a blurred mess of form and twisted contortions. The world turned and curled around the pair, a domain of stars and shadows billowing around as the words struck hard. I didn't take you as stupid though, the man continued lightly, almost cheerful, in that off-putting way as he continued to move. Izuku wanted to back away, wanted to retreat, as his eyes pooled with angry tears. But kid, I'd have thought you'd figured all of this out. And I'm pretty sure you have, but you're stupidly stubborn and just won't admit it. There was another soft scoff. It's why you're here, right? Why you came. Izuku wanted to deny it, wanted to say it had been a mistake. An accident. That the man was wrong. He just wanted to say something, damn it. The boy's hands shook, his heart beating loudly in his ears. The words replayed over and again as he struggled to stay upright, struggled to remain still, even as he was bound in place, unable to fall on his knees even if he wanted. He wanted to say the man was wrong. But he knew. They boy did. Izuku had given everything he had. He'd listened. He'd followed them, and still, through all of it, it was never enough, boy. That same voice jeered in his ears, silently slithering through his mind as his vision swam, a flash of silver and black swaying in front of him. It was never enough. Izuku swallowed and struggled to clear his throat, curling his hands into his palms as he steeled himself. One for all's energy continued to flare as the boy lifted his gaze to stare upwards towards the blurred face, his voice buckling beneath his worry. A droplet of blood splashed from his chin. And none of it mattered now, did it? Because he'd failed. Tubby. His voice felt rough, cutting through the vacuumed silence as he struggled to open his mouth, pushing through the pain to take back control. Gone, Gojo-sensei remarked simply, quietly, far softer than Izuku had ever heard him in the time that he'd known the man. And it's good that you can finally speak, kid. At that, the world twisted backwards and forwards, lights and shapes and shadows pulsing together as Gojo-sensei's cursed energy flared, and his words drained the energy that Izuku had left in him. He barely remained upright, forced to against his will, as the man stepped closer, heavy boots striking hard against the floor. Gojo-sensei was only loud when he wanted to be. When he wanted to prove a point. But you knew that, right? That he was gone, the teacher continued, seemingly unsurprised, his tone almost indifferent as he leaned closer to the boy, a hand falling on the boy's shoulder as the world sparked clearer. Blue pierced through the haze, to catch clarity in Izuku's vision as the man stared down the boy, studying Izuku, searching for answers. You always seem to know those things about him. And about the others. Without having to ask. The boy blinked blearily, trying to stop his arms from shaking as One for All rejected the world they were trapped in, the domain and the never-ending sea of energy that pulsed and slithered around the pair. A domain expansion that was impossible to escape from, forcing Izuku to face his thoughts and remember the things he wanted to forget. Like the other voided mess, the other energy, and all the small things that Izuku wanted to forget, wanted to refuse to remember. Because he'd been wrong. And right. And he'd screwed it all up. No use trying to defend yourself. Gojo-sensei shook his head and blew out a soft sigh as Izuku's ears rang. It was inevitable. The words still echoed. The laugh still scratched and tore at his ears, stripping away his resistance to the energy that pulsed and burbled and lapped against Izuku, the widening of the domain ever growing as the boy found himself unable to tear his eyes, vision blurred as it was, away from the man. Blinding white scored the corners of his vision, as more blood splashed down his chin. I can just tear his heart out, and then where would you be, boy? Standing before a corpse. Both of you so goddamn ideal and proud, but neither of you capable of actually stopping me. Or anyone else. You knew he was too strong and still you tried. Gojo-sensei's voice reminded Izuku of Aizawa-sensei in that moment as he spoke, chastising, almost condoning the boy for his actions. Almost pitying him for his foolishness. And it all fell apart. Because of you. Because of him. Because of him, damn it. Izuku wanted to say something, do something, blink, shout, cry, anything, but he couldn't. Gojo-sensei's domain expansion was always like that for him. Izuku could barely move even if he wanted to. It was sort of like, not yet 9. The pulsing of One for All thrummed softly as Izuku stared back at the man who only hummed and paced. And Izuku had tried to stop everything. He had. But he was to blame. And see, I knew that you weren't that stupid to think you weren't here for a reason, problem child. The man grinned easily, his face twisted into a beautifully bitter sneer as he stared down at the boy in front of him. Cerulean blue ward with the startled bottle green as each assessed the other, the man patiently, and not so patiently, waiting for the child to respond to his query, and the child too anxious and guilt-ridden, it seemed to make that attempt to hazard a reply. But Izuku didn't know how to reply, didn't know what to say as he stood, awkwardly fidgeting under the man's scrutinizing gaze, trying to understand what the other expected from him. His fingers tingled, sparks of lightning crackling as he said in a small breath. I thought it was just Sukuna at first, you know, the man continued casually, his voice still as light and careless as it always was. It left Izuku on edge, as his knees shook from the effort of staying upright. That curse can do a lot of things we don't quite understand. And maybe the reason you are here was because of that. Izuku's vision swam. The man stepped closer, towering over the boy as he leaned down. But then I figured that maybe it was more. Your power is unique. But you're too similar in energy and technique to be a no-one, kid. Especially to Sugure and Sukuna. Satoru Gojo was leaning forward, almost eye level with Izuku now as his smile never dipped. Intense stare searching the boy's face as he reached forward and jabbed a finger into the boy's forehead. But that's the problem, he murmured as the world slowed and Izuku felt his energy, and One for All screamed in rejection to the invasion of the man's presence to his senses. Voices lapped against his ears as iced fire tore through his veins. The intense stare sank through him as the man continued to murmur, almost a threat, almost kind. I can't tell if this is a curse for you. The world started to melt, vision twisting and coiling into a swirl of stars and swelling reverberations of sound that bounced through Izuku's head as his limbs gave way, fingers, arms, legs, losing sensation, and his head pitching forward like a rag doll, against the man's shoulder. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a weight lifting off his back as the world pitched dark, a slip into gray, blue, and black. Or, if it's a curse meant for me, kid. The energy was a thick cloud that hung heavy, suffocating, choking out the light as Izuku leapt into the fray, angling towards the enemy. A twinge of fear spiked against his senses, the world crackling around him as something felt off. Go ahead then, hero. Let's see how fast you really are. He could almost taste the ash on his tongue as light shrouded in gray, lightning crackled and snapped, as a royal of thunder clouded and snapped outward from him. Quirks beat against one another, energy striking outward, vicious and biting. It was dark, heavy, exhausting. Wrong. So wrong. Fury bubbled in Izuku's veins, as the air flared with blinding showers of light, mixtures of green and gold and red sparks swirling together through and by and around him, distorted by his energy and affected by his power. Braids of light twisted together in a tight coil of energy, snaking around Izuku as he tried to steady his breathing, will his chest to loosen the knots and expand his lungs as he glared ahead of himself. Not that it mattered if he could breathe. All Izuku really needed to do was see. And he could. He could see just fine. Perfect, in fact. Izuku's eyes trained on the sneering grin and the narrowed glare in front of him as he sailed forward, hair whipped back, salted tears pricking at his eyes as the world blurred and floated in a mess of distortion. Izuku had never been this angry before. He'd never really had a reason to be this angry either. Shigaraki! There was a small peal of laughter from the enemy as his silver-white hair swayed in the breeze, hands lifted outward to gesture towards Izuku mockingly as he sailed closer, ever closer to the enemy. You're just a little too slow, hero. He jeered, his attention aiming on the target in front of him, directly to his left, as the green-haired boy snaked around the blast of rubble and debris, his movements rabbit-quick, a comet trail of toxic green left in his wake as the enemy continued laughing. Bakugo was right behind him, turning wider to make his way to the most direct and open strike point as Shigaraki's left. Fiery blasts of molten air singed at Izuku's neck as the blonde shifted around him, a snarl on his lips. Don't get distracted, Deku! Which didn't help to temper Izuku's anger, only fueling it further instead. Because he could see the moment again as he pushed forward, angling to blast at the enemy. He could see the forest, and the trees, and the moment Kaken had been kidnapped and his heart had been in his throat and bile had been swimming upward, splashing against his teeth as he felt his bones rattle and his knees shake at the thought of staring down all for one of all the villains in the world, to get his friend back. The wave of power, and the energy and weight of that foreboding evil? He wasn't so concerned with All for One, not when All Might had been there, not when he knew that everything would be okay. When he trusted that it would come out right. And he'd never been this angry when everything had happened with Eri, with Mirio, with Naite, all because of one villain, one man. Chisaki. Eri had been abused and used over and over again by this selfish bastard. Destroyed to the point that she trusted very few and didn't even dare to try to free herself at first because she didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of her. Because she thought it was her fault. And then Mirio lost his quirk. Losing that power that was so inherently his own. That thing he treasured, that defined who he was as a hero? And sacrificing everything. And for what? For whom? Someone like Izuku? But someone like Eri? Of course that made more sense. It was a more rational and hero-like approach. That had been a nobler cause, a better reason. And Night Eye had known it. He'd understood it, just like Izuku had. He wasn't stupid. He knew who'd been most important at that moment. It still stung though. It still choked him up to let go of someone he'd come to admire. It still made him feel bitter that he couldn't have done more to save everyone, like he'd promised, like he'd insisted he would do. But no, he'd not been angry. Not then. Not in any of those instances. Sad? Guilty? Afraid? Had he been those things in any of those instances? God, yes. But not angry. Not fully. Nothing like this. Facing down the enemy who'd fought so hard to destroy everything that Izuku cared about, everyone that Izuku valued. A burst of energy erupted, scattering clouds and casting a light through the darkened air as a bottle-green glare pierced through the dust and settled on the target. Let him go! There was a crackle of toxic energy as Izuku rocketed through the sky, wind cutting at his cheeks as debris stung his eyes, tears pricking at the edges as he slammed into Shigaraki head-on. Torn gloves and broken nails dug into the scarred and mottled flesh of the enemy as a furious snarl tore from Izuku's throat as he bore down on the cackling opponent. With little thought for how shitty this could and probably, definitely, would go, the boy's fingers dug into the enemy's arms as he rammed his forehead against Shigaraki's own, emerald and crimson clashing in a war of fury and amusement as the boy tried to overpower the enemy away from his sensei. A flare of energy twisted upward and around, spiraling in a tornadoed whirl. Tamura. Shigaraki merely smiled, a snort and a snigger slipping through cracked lips as he leaned closer, his breath ghosting Izuku's face as a searing heat scorched the air about them. "So brave as a hero and so stupid too," he murmured, "and all for your sensei." What a joke. There was another snort, almost bitter as the flicked a gaze past Izuku and back towards the underground hero who'd struggled to stand straight, a glare firmly fixed on his face as he let his quirk remain alive and drawn on Shigaraki, allowing Izuku to get close, to get an elbow rammed into the man's sternum before the boy swung around and pummeled his arm into the other's jaw, knocking the other backwards, skittering across the rocky debris. A shower of dirt and rock rained down as the ground cracked, Izuku's feet pressing hard into shattering earth, as fury pounded through his veins, one for all alight with energy. A buzzing rang in his ears as cracks splintered outward, lightning kissing his skin, the force of his quirk's power welling beneath his fingers as Izuku sprang from the ball of his feet and launched upward and outward again. Something was wrong. Different. But he didn't care. It'll go quite well. The boy's attention was severed briefly by the intrusion of different voices ghosting through. Perfect energy source. The air rippled, waves of energy bending around them, as Shigaraki's grin grew larger the closer Izuku got. Izuku had to concentrate. He couldn't let himself get distracted now, damn it. Vessels are all the same. The younger boy snarled as he ped his arm backwards, fingers curling into a tight fist as sparks of green licked at his knuckles and coiled through every fiber and muscle. Midoriya. It wasn't like he wasn't expecting this to happen. In fact, he'd been waiting somewhat patiently, or impatiently because Satoru was rarely patient, for what he saw as an inevitability. And yet, the man squinted as his nose twitched, his senses tingling, almost like an electric current had gone live inside his head, buzzing animatedly, almost angrily. The man let a wry smile twist across his lips. Well, now that's interesting. A ripple of energy shuddered outward through the sky as Satoru lifted his eyes, that small flickering of the smile growing, as the heated pulses of energy sparked across his vision. Interesting was a loaded word, really. It was more not boring than anything else, and as the man's hair swayed with the breeze as another shuddering of light and energy burbled and pulsed, waves of green and red and silver slithered around in a spiraled halo that pulsed and rotated, expanding outward in bands of hues that shimmered and glinted against the sun's rays. It was different and beautiful, and Satoru couldn't help but let his thoughts and curse technique trail into action lazily as his curiosity got the better of him. He began to study everything. He wasn't really in a rush after all. Or that is, he wasn't in as big of a rush as the rest of the world always seemed to think they were or should be. Never was. And he never needed to move very quickly anyway, given that he was already moving faster than anyone else around. No one seemed capable of keeping up with him, though all of them felt like they needed to be going faster, moving more, doing more, being more. How annoying. Though, maybe that the man's smile still remained as he tried to sort through the dozens and hundreds of thoughts that ignited at the sight. Maybe he could admit that he was a little eager to understand this situation, this power. Not that he really needed anything to really keep his attention lately. Satoru had plenty to deal with his dead student who wasn't so dead anymore, and that was fun enough to figure out, because Sukuna could have something to do with it, or it could be more of Yuji's fault. Maybe it's both? And the whole being a vessel to Sukuna business was another thing entirely. And then actually having control over Sukuna as well? Yeah, lots to consider and lots to care about. And breaking the news to Megumi and Nobara that their only other first-year buddy wasn't, in fact, dead as a doornail? Yeah, Satoru wasn't really looking forward to that part. That could wait, really. This could wait, especially when Satoru was certain that Megumi specially wouldn't go off the rails and summon some demon dog to haul after him or something. Well, maybe not him, but certainly Yuji. He'd definitely summon something to go after Yuji. The flirt. Nobara too. And so, Satoru had put it off, allowing Yuji time to train, and sit in the basement watching old as sheet movies to try to get a handle on his newly founded curse techniques. Sort of. Oh well. Either way, it was bound to be a fun reunion. And he was excited for the moment Megumi, though it would probably be Nobara, took a whack at Yuji's face for FNG them over and keeping them in the dark with his whole, dead but not dead, just kidding routine. Yeah, it'd definitely be Nobara to kick the sheet out of someone and Megumi to summon the demon dogs. Not that it was his fault that any of this had happened in the first place. Totally not Satoru's fault that his kid was a verified zombie at this point, which was fascinating but also kind of horrifying and amazing all at once. Not that that mattered anyway. Minor details really. And there were too many thoughts going on for Satoru to really want to delve into them any longer. Not when the tantalizing prospect of the present issue was before him and a good enough distraction to keep him focused on a singular thing. At least for now. There was a pause as the man set his book down and turned towards the window more fully, fingers mid-turn as a third flicker of energy rippled just beyond the perimeter of the tree line. Seemed that this time things were going to finally pick up. Twisting pulses of green and silver and red continued to turn and knot and coil together, spidering outward as the epicenter of the disturbance grew wider and more wound in energy pulses. A ripple of purple waves of energy washed over the other colors, cascading downward and out, like a tumultuous roiling cloud. Satoru quirked his head and narrowed his eyes, the smile turning into a grin as the knotted mess of colors bled through and shattered the clouds of purple, sparking flickers of lightning bolts through the hazy view. The man had never really seen anything like it before. And he knew for damn sure that no one else had ever seen it either. Talking to others and doing the FING research, Satoru understood that this phenomenon was not planned, not expected, not understood. And definitely interesting now. And now there's another. A second one, he mused, smile growing as his brow quirked upward in curiosity. That one's new. Different and unexpected. It was a feat really, too, that he of all people was even saying that much. It wasn't every day that Satoru was left feeling surprised like this. Or surprised at all. Nothing was ever unexpected for him. Things rarely changed from what he anticipated and could see, which tended to make things a little boring and far more predictable than he wanted to admit, even when he was a kid. Which was one reason he didn't mind being a sorcerer so much. There was still that level of uniqueness that left him somewhat appeased and interested in reality, though most of everything wasn't so. And on the off chance that odd things did happen, and the weird sheet took place, Yuji and Yuta were prime examples, for instance. And Satoru was right there, in the thick of it, trying to make sense of it all. Because it all tended to pique Satoru's curiosity all the more, make him feel a little more alive, like he had more of a purpose, and an expectation beyond what was tangible to his senses and awareness determined within his cursed technique. To be a part of something not because he'd been expected to, or because he'd anticipated it happening, but because he'd wanted to, and had the choice to care, and invest his time and energy because of personal interest. That was a treat for Satoru. Like now, for example. The book lay forgotten, not that the man had really been reading it, only using the pages as a stand-in for passing the time, as long, languid fingers gently rapping the tome against the desk with a soft clatter. The particulars of War of the Worlds was something that the man just couldn't find the time to get interested in or really care about, as Satoru Gojo stood and placed his entire focus on the clouds and sky instead. There was a soft pop, the man's lower back adjusting, as Satoru stood, staring into the small changes the breeze brought as colors mixed and swirled and washed outwards from the epicenter in the distance. And echoing on the breeze there was that familiar air and energy that felt just as foreign all at once, with colors only visible to him, only apparent to his ability. The joys and drawbacks of his curse technique, really. Satoru was always privy to things that others couldn't comprehend or really acknowledge, which always gave him a leg up in battle or understanding situations. But also made it incredibly frustrating, lonely, perhaps, when he needed or wanted someone to talk to. Which is why the man had developed the ability to simply deal with shit on his own instead of bothering others with his issues. It's not like they'd understand anyway. At least not most of them, Satoru replied to himself, suppressing the urge to roll his eyes as he pictured Nanami trying to scold him for being too careless or shitty with his behavior, even if his thoughts were true. Not that he'd care, he murmured, speaking low into the stillness. The man continued to peer, almost unseeing towards the horizon, watching and waiting for the changes to take place, more energy to accelerate through the air, signaling that whatever had caused the shifts was finally here. He'd felt it all morning, of course, and seen the inklings painted across the sky as dawn gave way to mid-morning. Rumbling waves of energy grew and rolled, tossing wave after wave of twisting and curling pulses of intense power, as the shifting colors intensified and erupted through Satoru's vision like a clouded haze of green and blue and yellow and pinks and gold. And Satoru was intrigued why things hadn't dissipated like they had every day prior. It's not like it wasn't easy to feel the disturbances. They happened every day, cursed energy pushing and waving and crackling through the breeze. It wasn't a new feeling, or anything out of the ordinary. At least for him. But it hadn't been enough of a disruption to cause Satoru to give it too much thought or shift his attention until now. Every time prior, things had settled, and eased, and ended before they'd really begun. And Satoru was always left wondering. But now things were more interesting, easier to analyze the longer they curled and rolled and echoed out their energy across the sky. The small beacon of light was barely visible in the distance. Most people wouldn't have noticed even if they could see it. But anyone with half an ounce of awareness will have felt that power. The man with the 6 eyes mused to himself, hopping up onto the ledge of the windowsill, a trickle of excitement pulsing through his veins as the after breeze from the energy burst ruffled his hair. Which means that someone could or will eventually notice. The rim of the man's glasses caught the setting sunlight as bright sapphire blues hardened to a calculating stare. He knew it wasn't wholly uncommon that someone would be watching the area either, or planting something to distract some of the more proficient sorcerers from their main objectives, as it were. Either way. A smile stretched, almost biting as the sunlight caught on the rim of the man's glasses, sending a streak of brilliant golden beams across the man's sightline. Satoru shoved his hands in his pockets and fished for his phone, feeling the gentle buzzing of a solitary message sending his way, before he quickly turned back towards the classroom, and tossed the sleek black device back onto the desk. Whoops! How would anyone contact him now? To tell him of the mysterious energy that they noticed too late and the familiarity of it, and all the things that he had already noticed. It'll probably be Kento, the man hummed wryly, another glint of light catching on his glasses as he turned back to face the light source and energy waves. He's always got to stick up his butt about these types of things. And Satoru was always ignoring him about it all, ready to figure it out on his own for the time being and conveniently leave his DMED phone behind. To protect who he wanted and when he wanted for the time being. The tragedy of it all? Satoru let out a small snort, balancing on the ball of his feet for a moment, lifting his hand to his face and covering his eyes from the sun, as he stared straight outward trying to pinpoint the precise location amidst the larger field of energy bursts. Such a tragedy that no one could contact him, let him know of the energy, the possibility of it. So sad, Satoru retorted to himself, before stepping off the ledge and meeting air, falling into the trees. Now to investigate. He didn't have long before people realized where he was and what was happening, and frankly Satoru wanted to see for himself what this energy was. The breeze nipped at his ears and nose and cheeks, as a branch from a nearby tree caught his cheek, as the man's eyes narrowed from behind his glasses. Satoru needed some questions answered. He wanted to understand the connections he'd felt before the others figured out there was a problem or a potential problem, that is. He needed to get a read on what the pulsing energy meant, and why it was so familiar. Suguru. He wasn't sure if he believed it. And yet, Suguru? And yet, the air around him was cold? A small biting breeze nipped at the boy's skin. Everything tingled uncomfortably, aching and twitching, as his senses started coming back to life. fingertips and palms and wrists livening under the pulse of his senses and the blood flow that curled through his veins. But it was strange. His sluggish thoughts tried to make sense of what was going on, tried to catch up to the rest of his senses that were firing up and coming to life, tried to unknot the strange things, and fill the blank spots. It was almost shockingly cold compared to what he'd been used to, what he'd recalled the day had been like, how it had all started. Or so he'd thought, right? That's how it had started, hadn't it? How long ago had that been? How what had happened? Izuku's head was pounding as hazy recollections, images, sensations peeked through the filtered veil that dragged over his memory. A mind-rattling pain pulsed and wavered behind his eyes and wrapped around his head, making everything echo in his ears. Izuku could feel his heart in his throat as nausea rolled, bile crawling up from his stomach as each beat rammed against his skull. Everything ached, threatening to crumble beneath and within him if he moved too fast. Izuku was sure of it. Yet, he wasn't sure of anything. He couldn't. Somewhere, in the distance, another warning chimed as the boy arched his back and tried to move, tried to focus on getting up. He needed to get up. All right then. Do you think you want to open your eyes? The voice was soft, but blaring, too loud and too close, making the boy wince. Izuku's head gave a hard jolt of stabbing pain that signaled he was alive at least, not that he was certain, right now that he wanted to be, as his stomach proceeded to slosh uncomfortably and the swaying sensation rattled his nerves and made his muscles feel weak and unstable. Maybe that was one small thing to be glad about. He was still able to feel? Izuku blearily blinked, eyes slowly forcing themselves open, joints protesting, his head screaming as he scrambled at a snail's pace to try to recall. What had he been doing? What had happened before now? Before it had all gone dark? Muddled? Messy? Before it had gone into a voided mess of, come on now, you're taking so long for someone so strong. I would have thought you'd be on your feet by now, kid. Another bell chimed. A crackling of static prickled in his ears. Unless you're doing this on purpose, you're just a bit slow because you think you need to be. Which is really stupid. The voice was light, laughing, as bottle green orbs struggled to open, a sudden jolt of recollection worming through him at the jibe. Those words. You're a bit slow. Slow. A bit slow. He was moving. The boy's reserve of one for all ignited as muted memories finally filtered through the cracks and fissures that collected his thoughts. Izuku needed to move. He needed to end it. He needed to stop everything. He'd been trying to do that. He'd been trying to fix it and make it right. Be a hero. Be a hero, damn it. Get up. A wave of energy snared around Izuku's arms as he pressed power into his feet, eyes snapped open to peer upwards, towards the sky and the blurred, grinning face haloed by silver-white hair. You're slow. Shigaraki. Out of reflex and with a burst of adrenaline, the boy slammed his palms into the ground and blasted a wave of one for all's energy through the earth. The grass disintegrated beneath the wave of light and ignition of power, snapping the brush near his head and cracking rock and gravel and grassy soil he'd been laying on. Fissures spidered out from his palms as earth crumbled beneath his fingertips. Skiing in a small breath, his ears ringing and vision twisting, Izuku rolled to his left and landed another blow into the earth in order to create a debris cloud for more coverage because the enemy was too close. He needed distance. He needed to think. He needed to assess and launch an attack and get away from the threat. It was way too close. He was way too close. The enemy, the war, the fight. It was all too close, too looming and too destructive. And he wasn't capable of holding his own because he couldn't see, damn it. But he couldn't afford to fail right now and let everyone down. The boy's feet slid along the loose rubble of earth, the grass and gravel and rock and dirt, giving way at his feet as voices hummed in his ears, the static growing louder, buzzing and crackling. Izuku blinked, trying to clear his vision, renewing sight, before he was turning and angling into a crouch, nearly stumbling as his knees buckled, his head throbbing. Slow down 9. Wait. But he didn't have time to wait. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't delay anymore. He couldn't. He couldn't allow anyone else to die because he'd waited any longer to end this with Shigaraki. Stop the enemy. Stop the pain. Stop all of it. Where was Aizawa-sensei? What had happened in the time that he tried to launch that attack and he had to stop this now. 9, you need to stop. Think. Blinking furiously again, the boy raised his hand and set Black Whip out, his senses guiding him to aim at his target, feeling the energy pulses through One for All's quirk. He didn't need to see straight to know where his target was with this quirk. Not always. The same bell chimed distantly, again and again. Familiar and different. It was a warning that something was wrong this time, something was different. Something was off. Izuku grit his teeth and concentrated on pushing One for All into a concentrated wave, feeding into Black Whip's stream as the laugh echoed again, making the boy's head throb painfully, every muscle complaining as he tried to remain upright, and snapped Black Whip upward into a curve that would wrap around Shigaraki's arm. I don't think it's going to work, kiddo. Izuku felt his energy fizzle, as Black Whip suddenly faltered. The tendrils and waves of power slowly slithered to a halt, rebounded and shot backwards in a slow whistle that petered out. And what the hell? Izuku blinked furiously, straining to understand, straining to see and understand. The foreign, light laugh that was far too close again, tickling his ear as wind brushed against his cheek had Izuku jeering blearily to his right, arms raised, quirk alight as a smash rippled across his fingertips and knuckles aiming to land with solid surety. He could feel where the opponent was, the enemy's quirk signature present and focused and powerful. And different than what he remembered of Shigaraki's quirk and how it'd manifest that first time. He could sense it there and he'd make contact this time. He knew he would. He knew exactly where to place his blow. Except it never did make it. I have to say, kid, you've got pretty good reflexes. The voice was near his ear, each syllable touching his hearing, slipping against his ears, as Izuku jerked back in surprise at the intrusion. There was a solid, drawn-out moment of suspended movement, where Izuku felt like he was suddenly floating through water, every limb and pulse of energy dragged to a crawl as the boy slowly pushed his way against the invisible barrier that encompassed him, weighing him down. His hand reached out, trying to grasp towards the energy source he could sense, knowing this had to be Shigaraki. Because who else could it be? As a hand lightly tapped against his forehead. Sharp, searing pain lanced through his temples and sank through the aching mess that had been pounding through Izuku's senses the minutes prior, silencing thought, quelling the throbbing pulse through his skull until it was nothing but a dull headache simmering in the back of Izuku's head. A vacuum of silence followed, rattling hollow as jumbled memories and frantic words ceased to create the static in his mind, and all settled to stillness. The boy's vision that had been doubled and blurred now suddenly rearranged. Puddles of color shifted and sharpened, each detail sliding into focus like a puzzle done right, until Izuku was left reeling backwards, head tilted up towards the sunlight that glinted and flared brightly around the downy white head. That's better, the same condescending voice hummed, sapphire eyes glinted almost happily, though they were calculating and critical as the grinning giant of a man peered down on Izuku, completely unperturbed by the situation and by the boy's presence and attack. And really, who the hell was he? Izuku was struck dumb for a moment, uncertain how to react or what to say. And really, what could he say? What should he say? And where the hell? And who? What? The man crooned sing-song. You crying? Crying? Was Izuku crying? He didn't think. Is it gratitude that I see there, shining in your eyes? The man's voice skipped through Izuku's ears, as the taller, imposing force leaned forward, peering down on the boy. His easy, sparky smile never seemed to waver as he winked at Izuku, his eyes flashing behind the frames of his tinted glasses as he quirked a brow at the boy. Gotta say it's a common reaction when people first meet me, so don't worry. I'm used to it. And I won't tell. There was a laugh, off-putting and almost too happy to be sincere as the man continued to lean his upper body forward, staring down on Izuku, who struggled to understand what the hell was going on and where the actual hell he was. Because this wasn't the battle. There wasn't any destruction, no other members of the League of Villains. No nothing, no one. The boy's gaze shifted left, and then right as Izuku took it all in, noting the smooth pathway, the bright greens of the grass and the bushes that lined the wall of the garden where dozens of flowers seemed to be in bloom. More hung from branches in the trees. Wisteria, cherry, apple, all bright and flowered and blooming. And all calm, eerily calm. And nothing like Izuku recalled. Nothing like the battle he'd been fighting, so how the F did things end up like this? And how the hell did he get out of here and away from this? You're not going to beat me, so no use in being afraid of what that power of yours can do. And what? It took Izuku 2 solid minutes of silence to fully realize that it hadn't been night when he'd been fighting Shigaraki. It hadn't been the war. He wasn't in the middle of a battle. He wasn't even home for that matter. So who the hell was this guy? Where the hell am I? And where was Shigaraki? And Aizawa-sensei? And Kaken? And Gran? Were one for all ignited again as the boy's tension reached anxiety levels and he strained to force himself to recall, to understand, to get to the dead heart of the problem. But nothing was piecing together right. Nothing made sense. Nothing looked the same or even felt the same for that matter. It was all just wrong somehow. Nah, but that's such a useless question to ask right now, kid, the snowy-haired man retorted lightly, his oceanic gaze catching the sunlight as he peered above the rims of his glasses and down on the boy, expectant and amused by the unfolding stupor the boy found himself in. Better question, kid, is why the hell you're here, and, the man hummed while shaking his head, why you seem to be attracting curses to you like a magnet. Though that would explain the Suguru connections perhaps. Curses? Suguru? The man gave a gentle, dismissive wave before he shoved his hands in his pocket and finally leaned away from the boy who'd stiffened, every muscle tensing at the wave of energy still that roiled of the man, and the looming presence of several shadows nearby, tromping and rolling and slithering through the trees and bushes and grass as they dragged themselves closer to Izuku and his white-haired captor or whatever the hell he was. It was about as terrifyingly tense as All for One had been, the level of power and weight that nearly suffocated and crushed Izuku as he concentrated on the power that was apparent in the man who loomed over Izuku, standing like a stocky giant, with a glint in his endless gaze and a grin splitting his face. But I don't think they want to play nice with you, curse boy, the man replied tentatively thoughtful, though his tone trended towards amused. Which, I didn't really expect them to, though you never know how curses can be, now can? You. What? The boy was incredulous, as the other person only continued to chatter, pointing a finger towards one of the smaller creatures making its way past a low bush and easily lobbing itself towards the boy. Come on, kid, I know you're not stupid. I can see that much at least, the man retorted. You like a challenge and you certainly like fighting. I was just trying to pinpoint what you have to do with all of this supposed mess, and maybe just test to see how strong you actually are. What the F dash? Izuku bent his knees, hands readying in the defensive position as a massive, pockmarked and bulging gray slug-looking beast let out a guttural bellow, throaty and pitching towards Izuku as its eye swiveled on the child. Another, smaller creature, with thin, gossamer wings buzzed above the tree line, dripping green spit from its overly large teeth, muted blue body curved into a hunched ball as tiny hands clawed at the air. The white-haired man didn't seem too bothered by the situation though and only stood, watching Izuku's movements carefully, head tilted in, and eyes trained on the boy. His mouth quirked upwards in the ghosting of a smile as he seemed to analyze and assess. For a moment Izuku was reminded of Principal Nizu and his eerily observant behavior, but the boy didn't want to think on that too hard either because that would also bring about too much anxiety about performance, and about the connection between Nizu and the man standing before Izuku. And oh god, the thought of two Nizus running around the world was enough to make the staunchest of supporters draw back from furthering their support. Though, he supposed and tried to ignore the fact that maybe he'd also been like that too, analyzing heroes. Which was a FING weird blow to consider as. Another, louder screech, like a bird echoed to the boy's left as he turned with a sharpness that and a narrowed panic on a stalking giant figure that lumbered forward, overly large arms dragging low and spine protruding upward and humping as a massive mouth chomped from the beast's stomach. Eyes along the creature's arms strayed to study Izuku, who let one for all ignite again, concentrating his energy and panic into assessing the situation, and quelling the uncertainty and fear for the time being. Now I know that you can move faster than that. The call came out, ringing like a sharp lance to Izuku's head as the boy shifted low and continued assess, waiting for the next attack. His energy ignited a sparking haphazardly as he struggled to make sense of what the hell was going on. He couldn't think about it right now as more buzzing, more hissing, more energy swirled around, with 3 more beasts floating closer. Dollops of dark figures shadowed and peeked through the brush as forms slipped towards Izuku's vision. A trio of fish-like creatures, red and scaled with guppy faces and glassy eyes, chortled forlornly, eyes swiveling in circles as they swayed and swished through the air. Bring it back. Where did you put it? Where did you take it? I know you have it. Give it to us. You took it. You took it away. I want to go home. I want to go back. Let me go back. Give it back so I can go home. The energy snapped around the boy, green lightning flickering like toxic waves as the air grew denser, dark clouds and energy wrapping overhead, as the man only snorted in amusement. More trees and bushes rustled, voices and noises pricking at the boy's ears. They're almost like Nomu, his thoughts were churning as he scanned and strained to understand. But they're not quite the same. They all seem so unique and so different from anything that All for One had created. So why? Why did almost feel similar though? I figured that you were a curse too, you know, the man remarked, eyes closed as he shook his head lightly, smile wide and easy as he removed his glasses, carefully tucking them into the pocket of his shirt. Izuku started at the comment, an angry burble of shame and a slithering sense of fear prickling through his senses at the comment. Why should he be afraid though? He wasn't a curse, whatever that was, and if it was anything like a Nomu then he really wasn't anything like that. He had nothing that would indicate that. A lazy hand flicked through tendrils of waving white hair as the man sighed and tilted his head before sliding his eyes open. Izuku took an involuntary step back at the intensity of the gaze, the brilliant starlight blue gaze washing over him as the filter of the glasses removed the resistance to the man's obvious power in his gaze. White lashes framed the oceanic orbs as the man hummed evenly, sniffing as his fingers continued to thread through his hair, before he pursed his lips. But it's clear that you're not, he retorted. No, you're something else entirely. Which makes it all the more exciting. And all the more dangerous, for you. The man shrugged as the creatures drew closer, and the slug-like creature burbled out tentacles from its mouth, the guttural call echoing through the air as birds scattered and leaves rustled. Sheet! Izuku tore back in surprise as others traipsed forward, gaining speed on the boy as his quirk ignited in a rebuttal of power, his fist coming out to block the strike as he shot out Black Whip in a thin, coursing stream of energy that allowed him to wrap around a tree branch, hoisting himself away, another arm with spidering threads of blackened energy coursing outward to reach the creature and create a wrap around the beast before Izuku swung his arm, leaping backwards still, off the branch in a hop that created momentum enough to launch the slug beast upward and over into a nearby bush. There was a sound crash, the scattering of leaves and vines as branches snapped and the ground gave way. The buzzing of the flying creature reached Izuku's ear, to his right as the fish-like creatures angled for a frontal assault, both converging at the same time as the largest of the beasts stood and waited, watching. Give it back. You took it. A spray of water stung at Izuku's face, catching the boy off guard as he struggled to maneuver out of the way, as the flying creature caught the boy's shoulder. There was a piercing sting as thin talons punctured the boy's flesh, digging in deeper and eliciting a harsh hiss from the kid as he reached up and clawed at the bird-like monster, trying to force it to dislodge. The bubble of energy around them was growing more pronounced instead of diminishing, as he thought it might. He watched the boy rip the cursed spirit from his shoulder, with little hesitation, and no more than a grunt of disapproval as more lobbied for the boy's attention. The tension was growing, and it was apparent, judging by the child's face, that this entire situation was foreign to the boy, despite his apparent capability in identifying cursed spirits and handling them with relative ease. Not to mention his cursed energy. Satoru was rarely surprised, even when the situation itself was surprising. The growing energy levels were one of the less surprising moments. Though, the boy at the center of the apparent influx itself was one of the greater. The real surprise of the entire affair, in truth. Very odd, the man murmured, watching as the kid stumbled awkwardly back to step out of the strike zone of the cursed spirit that had made it towards the boy, with tongue extended and teeth bared like sharpened bits of knife. It wasn't for lack of trying or lack of power, however, that the boy moved a bit more sluggishly. No, that didn't quite make sense given what he could see using his 6 eyes and his normal deductive observation, the machinations of his mind moving more rapidly than others could often blink. His movements are deliberately slow, almost intentionally awkward. He parsed through each stumble, carefully placed, watching the boy's face contort from surprise to determined refusal as he rebuffed the cursed spirit with relative ease, a solid strike of electrified energy snaking down his shoulder and into his fingertips as he pummeled into the creature's face-like form, sending it rocketing backwards. Admittedly, Satoru was somewhat perplexed by the whole situation, though he'd never show it. It was as invigorating as it was confusing, though Satoru wasn't fond of being confused. It was sort of annoying. More than annoying. It set him off, actually. He didn't like not understanding something. Something that should have been so simple given all the clues he'd been handed from the beginning of this whole F&G mess. The minute the energy had first appeared, he'd been right about everything. Everything. But then? This boy of all things? A child? That was the oddest part of it all. It was a child and not a curse, like he'd been expecting. An ordinary child, bearing extraordinary power and prowess as the boy's feet ignited with flickerings of lightning, brilliant cascades of jeweled green wrapping around the child's being, worming upwards from the boy's heels and towards the spine as 2 more creatures squared off against the boy, angling for attention, trying to snap at him and consume the energy he exuded. Tantalizingly pronounced and vibrant energy that lit up the sky and filtered through his aura like a cascade of pigments, shooting outward to capture others' attention. A lure to the others nearby, curses homing in on a beacon of some sort perhaps. And all of this felt oddly familiar in all the details too, he realized too soon and perhaps too late, scanning the perimeter for any sign of the familiar signatures he could feel oozing off this kid who stood, back straight and ready for the larger cursed spirit with the gaping mouth and lumbering arms to barrel forward. This one was clearly the strongest of the lot, by a large margin, as it stomped through the trees and cracked the ground, building up speed, to ram into the child who stood, and listed to the side once in a ghosting of a feint, before he pushed in the opposite direction at a lightning-quick speed, the sparks of green and gold, with flecks of red intermixed, trailing behind him like a comet, as his cursed energy coiled tightly around his body and ignited his movements. It's a bit like Yuji, less like Sugure, except the curse beacon. Yes, except that. Who the hell was this kid? Give it back to us. The boy curved a wide berth around the largest of the curses, cutting a larger path to pull behind the enemy as he lifted his leg and swung around into a full rotated kick that allowed the momentum to cast the weight of the boy's body into the blow. Satoru carefully noted the way the cursed energy shifted and poured into the boy's strike connection, the force of the blow energized by the concentration the boy held with landing the strike on the enemy. At the moment of connection itself, the blow erupted with color, green, gold and red simmering into a swirl of explosive energetic intensity that rocketed into the creature's side and sent the brute contorting into a sideways flip that sent him into a tree. The boy warily completed his rotation and only missed avoiding the fish-like cursed spirit's angered bites as he moved to adjust his footing at the same time. Still a kid. The man smiled as he shook his head. Of course he'd missed that. 9. You have to move. You have to pull back. Concentrate on your energy levels and use Black Whip to extract them from you. The wind ruffled Satoru's care as he narrowed his eyes, a spark of renewed suspicion and curiosity igniting behind his gaze as he stared at the scene and the agitated boy who reached up to carefully pull at the fish curses who were hissing and demanding retribution. Give it back. Other shadows simmered close by the child in different hues enrobing the boy as he expended more energy and a different curse technique to pull the beasts off of himself. Blue and gold billowed around the wielder as dark tendrils of cursed energy snaked out of the child's fingertips and he struck at one fish-like curse, a long gash on his shoulder trailing blood as he ripped away the toothy hold. The other, though, had latched onto his back, and in the small frenzy of fighting, the bird-cursed spirit dove downward and speared against the child's head, diving hard to strike a killing blow as the boy ducked low and tried to pull the other create off of him. A screech echoed through the air as the energy still grew, more colors intensifying as the boy continued to figure to get the demed fish curse off of him, sidestepping the largest of the curses with another awkward stumble. This one far less precise, Satoru noticed as he took a step closer, sensing another presence nearby. He supposed he should lend a hand and test the boy to see what he was worth as another potential student. And as a threat. The council wasn't going to like him either, that was for DM and sure. So, Satoru would do what Satoru would usually do when he was faced with something like this. Whatever he DMN well pleased. The council. This was a kid. A powerful, potentially dangerous kid, but still a kid. So this was Satoru's problem. Well, see, now that's not very nice of them. The man was near the boy's side, watching as the child stiffened and startled at Satoru's sudden emergence and proximity. Forest green ward with oceanic, as the man hummed softly and almost sneered towards the curses that circled them, reaching up to point a finger towards the bird. Nasty little nuisances, he muttered as a blast of red zipped from his pointer and erupted into the sky. So much for subtlety. There was a rumble as the color engulfed the air and the clouds that surrounded, turning all the living in his path to ash as Satoru then turned his attention towards the largest of the beasts. Finger immediately pointed a lock onto the curse as Satoru Gojo tilted his head and grinned wickedly. "You're not even a challenge," he muttered darkly. "Which is shame because then this gets boring." Another blast of red demolished the area and carved a long pathway of destruction as trees and brush and curses were reduced to nothing. Which was as it should be, Satoru decided as he reached out and ripped the other fish-like curse from the boy's back. More streams of blood oozed from the boy's new wounds as the man lifted the whimpering fish creature up towards his face. "But you stole it. You must give it back." The beast retorted over and again. Satoru only rolled his eyes and quirked a brow at the beast. "And why the hell would I do that?" he replied with a grin. "I have more than you'll ever." There was a brief moment that the man stared at the beast, gazing into the thoughtless, unseeing eyes of the creature as he noted the vacancy and lack of care that this creature had for anything other than his objective. Just kind of pathetic really, he decided, tossing the beat up to the sky, and following it with another, deafening blast of his own power, to demolish what remained of the curse's physical form. As the others started to back away, as Satoru's grin widened, a jeering laugh burbling from his lips as he peered down on the child. Wide, innocent great eyes stared up at him, questioning. But there wasn't time for questions. The man grinned again the boy and lifted his hand towards the child. "Now," he murmured, "let's have a real go, shall we?" The boy couldn't even sek in a breath before he was propelled backwards by a gusted blow of energy and air, as the man's fist collided with his stomach, knocking all wind and sense and energy from him as Izuku struggled to understand what the hell was happening. "Izuku!" The boy was bounced backwards, and then sideways as he struck an uprooted tree and bounced into several broken mounds of earth, rolling into grass and muddy dirt. The boy's mouth filled with soil as he slid to his knees and warily dragged himself to his feet, keeping a side eye on the man as he let one for all increase in percentage to defend himself against whoever the hell this enemy or friend or. "So, your name is Izuku then? That's somewhat useful, though not really," the man remarked offhandedly, with another nod of his head as he shifted and moved closer at a more pronounced speed, catching Izuku off guard with a sudden emergence in front of the boy. "I thought you had it all figured out." "Silly me for thinking that, kid." The man's fist came out to land another punch, but Izuku was ready this time, pulling his hands into a block and leaning down low so that he could strike a hit on Satoru instead of the opposite. With a low maneuver, tilting his shoulders downward, the boy pulled into a hard strike, trying to gut-check his opponent turned tentative friend turned rejectionist. 40%. The boy, Izuku, was not going to give up so easily as he lifted his fist and rammed it into the man's stomach, only to be rebuffed by an invisible force that physically rejected Izuku's initial strike and stonewalled against the next blow he tried to land as well. And the one after that. Even his Air Force kick was recoiled back towards Izuku once more as the man only laughed and sidestepped, doing a small rotation as he curved into a tight circle, leaning his head back to speak into Izuku's ear as the boy tried to navigate his confusion and the laughter that continued to echo. "That's a shame there," the man retorted, not the least bit surprised or upset by the developments. "I thought you'd at least land that hit." Izuku pivoted and rotated, swinging another blow around to connect with the man's face, as the other merely snorted and laughed a little more. Another wide step had the man also turning into a rotated shift and pivot as he wagged his finger towards Izuku, who glowered at the respond. "Such a pity that you think I'd just give you this win." The man swept out his food and angled to trip Izuku, who leapt upward and brought his fist up to do a smash against the smug man's comfort zone of a face. Because he didn't know what the hell was going on, let alone why the hell the man seemed to think he'd want to even start in this situation to begin with. Izuku's arms snapped backwards. As the rebuff pushed Izuku away, the man's laughed, filling his ears as a prickle of pain erupted the back of Izuku's head. "Like I said, kid, you won't be able to beat me. I don't even want to fight you." The boy bit out between a small, gruff inhale, trying to adjust and maneuver away from the man. "You don't have to do this. I don't even want to do this. So just..." There was another hard moment, a blow nearly snapping hard against Izuku's chin before he was able to pull back and removed himself to calm down as he watched the man continue to circle Izuku, hands in his pockets and firm grin still in place. "I never said I gave you a choice, kid." "Satoru." There was a drawn sigh as the ground rumbled beneath Izuku's feet, as the man shook his head lightly and rammed an elbow into Izuku's stomach, filtering into the boy's vision before he could comprehend movement had taken place. The boy twisted out of the way, only taking a minor blow as he reached out and tugged at the man's appearance, trying to throw him over and backwards, onto the man's back as he did so. A firm, bony hand snaked out and grasped Izuku's wrist as a hard, clear blue gaze leveled on Izuku. The intensity of the world shifted in that look as the man's smile only twisted between sincere and condescending. "You're late, Kento. I was expecting you 2 minutes ago." The man struck at Izuku before tossing him backwards, approaching again with a rapid speed and little time for Izuku to maneuver out of the way. A rough shoulder to the boy's sternum left Izuku wheezing, as his eyes watered and his vision blurred again. But the boy wasn't completely helpless, his senses still alert, still brightly firing as he traced the energy and movements around, straining his ability to follow the massive weight of power as it shifted. There. The boy's movements were lightning quick, his drive pressing Izuku forward as he brought his fist up in an attempt to punch the man's stomach, in hopes of landing the blow he'd intended. With his attention pulled towards the stomach, though, Izuku brought a leg out and rammed it into the man's kneecap and pressed against the white-haired giant of a man's knees, arching his back and turning into a flip as he brought the moment into an escape. "You're not going anywhere, kiddo." The voice was nearby, hissing through his ears as Izuku winced. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me," the man, Saru, hummed, near Izuku's ear as he reached out again and grasped onto the older man and pulled backwards again, putting a step backwards and a half turn into his movements as he worked into a rotation to throw the other off, neglecting the hand that still remained on his own shoulder. With a hard pull backwards, Izuku felt the man's footing give way as he pulled more firmly and turned, continuing the momentum before calling on One for All to help him completely dispatch the man away from himself. Izuku was getting a little claustrophobic about the whole situation. "You won't let anyone forget about you," came the nonplussed reply from the blond man that caught Izuku's attention as he sidestepped another one of the taller man's advancements and strike. "That's very true." There was a laugh as the man circled Izuku, who spied stranger gnome-like creatures beginning to emerge from the bush. Panther-shaped and bear-shaped, each with dark coats and long, needle-like teeth, strayed ever closer, unwary of the man that squared off against Izuku, who leapt forward again and made an attempt to feint to the left and pull around the back of the man, trying to catch the taller, white-haired enemy off guard as he turned, mid-air and pushed backwards, propelling his shoe into the man's back, forcing the other into a stumble. Izuku didn't wait for the other to regain his momentum or his stability and chose, instead, to continue the rotation, arching his back and pulling into another flip that twisted Izuku up and overhead the man before landing him face to face with the taller opponent. Sky and grass clashed as Izuku caught the man's expression, before his fist collided with the man's jaw, sending the man into another stumble. But the gaze, hard and calculating as ever, never shifted. The boy realized too late as he landed, his knees trembling, feet aching, and thoughts jumbled as he tried to assess what was going on. It set him off as he watched the man stand straight and wipe the blood from his nose. Breathe, 9. You have to think this through. There was a blink, another step as the man took a moment to adjust himself, before he was back facing Izuku again, eyes flashing, grin in place, as a hard hand landed on Izuku's shoulder. I don't think you understand what I meant when I said that you wouldn't beat me, kid. The hand on the boy's shoulder tightened its grip as pressure increased in the boy's arm, working down through his muscles, and making everything ache, before the boy felt a heavy, looming weight of energy pour over him, as a hand rested on his head, fingers grazing his temple. Satoru. The world sparked brighter for a moment, all color, light, sound, erupting like fireworks as the boy's head struggled to keep up with the overabundance of everything. Thoughts collided, emotions surged, and the world twisted into a ball of static electricity that exploded before immediately ceasing and dropping Izuku into a void of darkness. You cheated. I agree you did cheat. Kanto's voice carried from his position across the field from where Satoru carefully positioned the unconscious boy into a secure hold, tucking his grip under the boy's arms before turning the child and gingerly wrapping the boy's left arm over his shoulder. A sidelong glance towards the bush, where the boy had noticed the curses before Satoru had, gave the man pause as he grinned briefly. The smell of upturned soil was always nice. Helped him to think. I don't know what you're talking about, Kanto, he retorted, and would you mind, since you know I have, he gently indicated with a tilt of his head as Nanami sighed and shook his head, his own glasses catching in the light as the sun peeked through the branches of the mature trees that hung nearby. Blooming spring was gradually shifting, flowers giving way to the greenery that would lead to summer. You also know nothing about your phone mysteriously ending up on the desk instead of with you, Uchim? You think I didn't notice? The man queried, loosening his tie and readying his weapon, the long, wide blade materializing with a smooth, deliberate and precise fluidity that spoke of Kanto's years of practice. I'm not stupid, Satoru. Satoru only grinned as he nodded, the smell of the cherry blossoms mixing in with the ash that fell like snow as the guttural groans of more curses swirled around them, materializing with every moment they stood and delayed. You still cheated, Kano Nanami hummed as he leaped and sprinted towards a trio of enemies lumbering towards Satoru and the boy who was now unconscious and clinging to Satoru, even in his unaware state. He actually got a hit on you. And at that, Satoru could only still for a moment, eyes narrowed on the mop of green curls as he studied the boy's energy signature, noting the way the surplus weight of the boy's cursed energy had diminished greatly. As though it wasn't wholly there. Another oddity. The shrieks of dispatched curses filled the man's ears as he stared at the boy for a moment longer, before turning towards his friend. You'll need to help me when you're done playing, he winked towards Kanto. I still have one more stop to make. Kanto only narrowed his eyes in questioning, peering back at Satoru from behind his thicker framed glasses as he frowned, and lifted his weapon to the ready. A large spray of blood slithered downward, bright red gleaming against the polished silver. I hate you sometimes when you're so DMN cryptic. Satoru only smirked in reply. He rather liked being cryptic, thank you. It wasn't his fault that no one else understood. And as it was, one color was still missing. Do you think they'll notice? The voice was tentative, though the question was somewhat profound, he would admit. That they'll figure it out? A stark contrast to what he was used to from these idiotic creatures. The man only shook his head, bright smile worming across his face as he lifted his menu and peered at the today's special. Gyoza. Oh, he'll notice all right. He murmured after a moment, fingers tapping against the edge of the laminated bifold. He always does. He was counting on it. Shoyuda was halfway down the tree when he sensed a shift on the breeze. Well, you're not quite what I was expecting. Shoyuda struggled to right himself, pivoting and tugging on the branch that gave way as he felt the air grow heavier the closer the voice echoed to him. With a grunt, the underground hero hoisted himself up, pulling his leg taut against the trunk of the tree before kicking back and releasing in time to fall towards a lower branch. How the hell he ended up in this FNG thing in the first place? Very acrobatic there, ninja fan. I'm almost impressed. Shuta's quirk flared to life as he turned, capture weapon threaded through his fingers as he twisted and curled into a flip before casting the defensive material outward with a snap to meet the grinning man who stood above him, white hair swaying as ocean eyes glittered in amusement. How the hell? The other man's smile only grew wider as he flicked a hand upward, fingers snapping out to swat lightly at the air, sending a shockwave outward that propelled the capture weapon off course as Shoyuta stepped back again and jumped off the branch, landing with a crouch, golden gaze flashing as his hair floated around his ears, a wariness growing. Who the hell was this? And why wasn't his quirk working on him? But that's a neat trick, the other man continued nonchalant, leaning against another tree as he crossed his arms and peered down his nose at Shoyuta. The broken branch that had held the underground hero aloft lay in a heap between them, the wind blowing gently, leaves dancing. Much more interesting than your little flips, my man. Something felt off. Wrong. White hair ruffled gently as the man laughed, his blue eyes reflecting a harder, more critical assessment of the situation by contrast. Energy rippled around him in a buzzing wave. You're pretty powerful, aren't you? Just like the other one. The green-haired boy. Quite the power he had. Shoyuta tensed at the mention of Izuku, to which the man's smile grew, his eyes flashing as he laughed lightly. But I think, just between you and me, the man winked, his crystalline gaze shining with an unreadable emotion that left Shoyuta on edge. He's probably the stronger of the two of you. The underground readied himself for a fight, jaw clenching as he glared towards the man. Where's Midoriya?